Welcome to the first part of the Ultimate HTML and CSS series. In this series, I'm going to take you on a journey and teach you all the skills you need to build fast and beautiful websites that look great on all kinds of devices. In the first part, we're going to talk about the fundamentals of web development with HTML and CSS. In the second part, we'll explore the advanced concepts. And in the third part, we'll put everything together and build a beautiful, responsive, and blazingly fast website for an imaginary cloud hosting company called Moshify. If you want to play with this website, just head over to moshify.com and see it for yourself. This is what you're going to build in this series. I'm Mosh Hamadani, and I'm super excited to be your instructor. Now, let's jump in and get started. I've carefully designed this course so it can be used by both absolute beginners as well as people with some experience in HTML and CSS who want to fill the missing gaps. If you already know the basics and want to learn about specific topics, you're welcome to jump to those parts, but I highly encourage you to watch the course thoroughly from the beginning because I'm going to share a lot of tips and tricks along the way and I don't want you to miss out on them. Trust me, I'm not going to waste your time by over-explaining things. Alright? Next, we're going to talk about the tools you need to take this course. Alright, let's talk about the tools you need to take this course. For the starter, you need a code editor. There's so many code editors out there, like Visual Studio Code or VS Code, Sublime Text, Atom, and so on. In this course, I'm going to use VS Code along with a few extensions for starting a web server and formatting our code. You're welcome to use your favorite code editor if you know what you're doing, but otherwise, head over to code.visualstudio.com and download the latest version of VS Code. Now here inside VS Code, we're going to install a couple of extensions. So let's open the extensions panel and search for Prettier. Here's the extension we're going to install, Prettier Code Formatter. With this extension, we can format our code and make it pretty. This is a very popular extension. As you can see, it's been downloaded more than 9 million times. So over here, you're going to have an install button. Just click it and you're done. Next, we're going to install another extension called Live Server. With this, we can launch our website inside a development web server. Again, this is a very popular extension. It's been downloaded almost 8 million times. Now, in addition to these, we're going to use a browser to view and test our web pages. Again, you can use your favorite browser, but in this course, I'm going to use Google Chrome, and I encourage you to use the same browser so you can easily follow the course. We're going to start our web development journey here. In every section, you will learn something new about web development, and by the end of this course, you will put all of this together to build a beautiful web page. In this section, we're going to talk about the fundamentals of web development. You'll learn the languages and tools used in web development, as well as the key concepts and vocabulary such as URL, HTTP, DOM, and so on. We're also going to talk about how websites work, so you will understand what exactly happens under the hood when you use your browser to visit a website. You will also learn how to inspect network traffic using Chrome DevTools, which is a very powerful tool used by front-end developers. We'll also talk about the basics of HTML and CSS and validating web pages, which is something a lot of developers miss. This is going to be an awesome journey, so let's jump in and get started. This course is your first step towards becoming a web developer. So let me give you a simple roadmap to know where you are and where you should go next. Every website has two parts, a front end and a back end. The front end is the part that you see in your browser and interact with, all the visual aspects. The back end is the part that powers the front end. It's behind the scenes and it's mainly about storing data in databases and providing it to the front end. So web development jobs fall into three main categories: front end development, back end development, and full stack development, which involves both front end and back end development. Front-end developers use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to build front-ends. Back-end developers have different sets of tools available to them, which is outside the scope of this course. So let's talk about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. HTML is short for Hypertext Markup Language. I know it's a mouthful, but basically we use HTML to define the building blocks of our web pages. CSS is short for Cascading Style Sheet and is used for styling web pages and making them beautiful. JavaScript is used for adding functionality to web pages. Let me give you an analogy. Think of a building. A building in the real world is like a web page on the internet. It has a skeleton or structure. It can have pretty walls, windows, and tiles, and it can have certain functionality. For example, when we press the elevator button, it comes to pick us up. Here's a real example. Let's say we want to build a website like Twitter. For each tweet, we want to have a layout like this. So first we use HTML to define all the building blocks of this layout. What are these building blocks here? An image, some text indicating the user's Twitter handle, another block of text containing the message, and 3 icons for commenting, retweeting, and liking the tweet. We use HTML to add these building blocks to our web page. Then we use CSS to give it visual effects. For example, with CSS, we can make the font bold, we can make our image round, we can add some padding around here, we can change the color of these icons and define their look when we hover over them. So CSS is all about aesthetics or visual effects. With CSS, we can also create beautiful animations. Now, most web pages these days are interactive. They respond to our actions like clicks and scrolls. This is where JavaScript comes in. With JavaScript, we can add functionality or behavior to our web pages. For example, we can like a tweet. So JavaScript is a programming language, while HTML and CSS are not, meaning we cannot use them to tell computers what to do. We use them to define the building blocks of our web pages and style them. Every web page you have seen on the internet is built with these 3 languages. So the better you learn and understand these languages and their features, the better you will be at front-end development. So your front-end development journey starts with HTML and CSS. I would say if you spend 3 to 5 hours every day studying and coding, you should be able to have a reasonable understanding of these 2 languages in about a month or a month and a half. Once you learn these languages, then you need to learn JavaScript. I have a separate series for learning JavaScript. So after finishing this series, you may want to enroll in that series. I would say learning JavaScript would probably take another 6 weeks of your time. Of course, you're not going to be a JavaScript expert in just 6 weeks, but you will have a reasonable understanding of it, and you will learn more as you work on different projects. So the first 3 months is all about the fundamentals. Now, building websites often include a bunch of repetitive tasks. This is where front-end frameworks and libraries come in. A framework or a library comes with a lot of code that we can reuse in our websites. So they help us get the job done faster. That's why a lot of companies these days use one of these popular frameworks like React, Angular, or Vue. Now, technically, React is not a framework, it's a library. But subtle distinction aside, all these tools serve the same purpose. They help us build applications faster. Now, you don't need to learn all of these to get started. Different companies use different tools for different projects. So as you move from one project to another, you may want to learn about the other tools. If you're starting out, just focus on React because it's the most popular tool in this space. Once you learn React, you can always learn the other tools if needed. For React, you would probably need 1 to 2 months. Again, I have a comprehensive course on React. More than 40,000 people have taken this course and loved it. All right, what's the next step? Version control systems. We use a version control system to keep track of our project history and work collaboratively with others. There are many version control systems out there like Git, Subversion, Mercurial, and so on. But Git is the most popular tool in this space and is used in more than 70% of software companies. That's why you'll see it in almost every job description. I would say you would probably need 2 weeks for learning Git. And again, I have a comprehensive course for you. So these are the essential skills that every front-end developer must have. You'll see these listed on almost every job description. Now, different jobs require other skills, but these skills vary from one company to another. So you can learn these additional things in the future or on the job. For now, just focus on these 4 skills or 4 steps. Remember, less is more. Don't try to learn too many things quickly. You won't learn anything. You'll just waste your time. All right, that's your roadmap. Next, we're going to talk about how the web works. Have you ever wondered how the web works? In this lesson, I'm going to tell you exactly what happens the moment you type the address of a website into your browser and hit enter. As part of this, we're going to talk about a few important concepts and terms that you need to know as a web developer. So let's say we launch our browser and head over to a website like codewithmosh.com. Now this address that we have in the browser address bar is called a URL, which is short for Uniform Resource Locator. Basically, it's a way to locate a resource on the internet. Resources can be web pages, also called HTML documents. They can be images, video files, fonts, and so on. So we type the URL of a website and hit enter. What happens now? Well, there are two pieces involved here. The browser, also called the client, and the computer or computers that host our target website. We refer to these as web servers or servers for short. This is what we call the client-server model. The client requests a service. The server provides that service. So our browser sends a message to the server and says, hey, give me the home page of this website. This is kind of similar to how you send your friend a text message. You can think of your phone as the client sending the message and your friend's phone as the server receiving the message. Now back to our example. This message is formatted based on a protocol called HTTP or Hypertext Transfer Protocol. You've probably noticed it before but never knew what it is. In simple terms, HTTP is a language that clients and servers use to talk to each other. It's not a programming language, it's just a plain textual language for communicating over the internet. We also have HTTPS, which is HTTP with encryption. So the messages exchanged between the client and the server are encrypted. Here's a simplified example of an HTTP message. With this message, the browser tells the server what it's looking for. So on the first line, it says that it wants to get a page or a file called index.html using HTTP version 1.1. Index.html often represents the home page of websites. On the second line, we can see the host, that is codewithmosh.com. And on the third line, we can see the language that the client can accept, in this case, English. Now don't worry about memorizing any of this. All I want you to understand here is that this message is structured based on the HTTP protocol that clients and servers understand. So the server receives this message, it figures out what the client is asking, and then it will send a message back to the client. The first message is called an HTTP request, and the second message is called an HTTP response. Every data exchange using the HTTP protocol involves two messages, a request and a response. Now, what is in the response? Here's a simplified example. On the first line, we see the version of HTTP protocol used, followed by a number which is the status code. 200 means successful or OK. Right below that, we can see the date and time of the response. Next, we can see the type of content the server is sending back to the client, in this case, text/HTML. And after that, we can see the HTML code or the HTML document that represents the homepage of codewithmosh.com. Of course, the actual HTML code is way longer. Now, as the browser reads this HTML document, it constructs what we call a DOM or a document object model. Don't let this fancy name scare you. This is a model that represents the objects or elements in our HTML document. What are these elements? All the building blocks of our page, like paragraphs of text, images, links, and other stuff. You will see this in action in the next lesson. Now, as the browser is reading this HTML document that is returned from the server, it discovers references to other resources in this document, like images, fonts, and other stuff. Each of these resources has an address or a URL. So for each resource, the browser sends a separate HTTP request to the server to fetch that resource. Many of these HTTP requests are sent in parallel, so we can see the page as quickly as possible. Once the browser has all the necessary resources, it will render the HTML document. Rendering an HTML document means displaying it. It's a fancy technical term we use often. So in a nutshell, our browser sends an HTTP request to the server and receives an HTTP response. This HTTP response contains an HTML document. The browser reads that HTML document to construct a document object model and render the page. In the next lesson, I'm going to show you all of these steps in action. All right, let's see HTTP requests and responses in action. So open up Chrome and head over to google.com. Now we need to access Chrome DevTools. This is a very powerful tool used by front-end developers. So on the top, we go to View, Developer, Developer Tools. Now look at the shortcut. On Mac, it's Alt or Option, Command, and I. On Windows, it's obviously different, but remember the shortcut because it's much faster to access the DevTools via the keyboard. So here's the DevTools. The first time you see it, it might appear a bit intimidating, but trust me, it's much easier than you think. Throughout the course, you're going to learn more about the DevTools. So here we have a few different tabs: Elements, Console, Sources, Network, and so on. In this demo, we're going to go to the Network tab so we can inspect the network traffic to and from google.com. Now, by default, DevTools is docked to the bottom of the screen. We can dock it to the left, to the right, or undock it as a separate window. So over here, we can dock it to the left side. A lot of front-end developers like this layout, so they put DevTools on the left side, and they have their website on the right side. Now in this demo, I'm going to undock it as a separate window, so we have more space to work with. So let's undock it. Good. Now we need to refresh our website. As you can see over here, on Mac we can press Command and R. On Windows, it's probably Control and R. Alternatively, we can go back to this window and press the refresh button. Now, back to the DevTools, look at all these items over here. These are the HTTP requests that are sent from our browser to google.com. As you can see, there are totally 45 requests, and here's the amount of data transferred over the network. So in this case, just over 94 kilobytes. Now look at the first item in this list. This is the first HTTP request that Chrome sent to google.com. As you can see, with this request, the browser wanted to get a document, and the status of this request is 200, which means OK. Over here, you can see the amount of data transferred over the network for this request, and the time it took to get the response. Now, if we click on this request, we can see more details about it. So here on the Headers tab, we can see all the headers of our request and response. So here are some general headers like request URL, request method, which is GET, status code, that is 200, we talked about it, remote address, this is the numeric representation of google.com. Now down below, we have response headers. There are so many headers here, you don't have to worry about them. But as an example, look at content type. We talked about this in the previous lesson. So the type of this response is text/HTML. Below that, we have the date and time of the response. Now if we click on the preview tab, we can see a preview of the HTML document that is returned from the server. So this is the home page of Google. Now in this HTML document, we have references to other resources like images, fonts, and so on. So all these subsequent requests are sent to download those resources. So right below the first request, we have a request for downloading a PNG or an image file. Here's another request for getting another image. We have two requests for getting two different fonts and so on. Now we can easily filter this list. So let's click on the filter icon here. By default, we see all requests, but we can filter by request type. For example, we can select doc to see requests for downloading HTML documents, or font to see the requests that were sent to download fonts and so on. Next, I'm going to show you how to create your first HTML document. Alright, first things first. Here on your desktop or anywhere on your computer, right-click and create a new folder. I'm going to call this HTML, but we could call it anything. Now, let's go back to VS Code and open the Explorer panel. Then we go to Open Folder and open the folder that we just created. Good. Now, this folder is currently empty, so let's add a new file here called index.html. As I told you before, index.html often represents the homepage of websites. So let's go with that. Now we can close the Explorer panel by pressing Command and B on Mac or Control and B on Windows. Good. Now, the first thing we need to do here is to tell the browser that this is an HTML5 document. So we type a left angle bracket. Now look at this suggestion list. The first item here is doc type or document type. Let's press Enter or Tab. VS Code generated this piece of code for us. So with this line of code, we can tell browsers that this is an HTML5 document. This line of code here is called doctype declaration. In the previous versions of HTML, our doctype declaration was so long, it was so messy, but HTML5 solved this problem. So all we have to type is doctype HTML. And by the way, HTML is not a case-sensitive language, which means it's not sensitive to uppercase and lowercase letters. But conventionally speaking, we type everything in lowercase except doctype. This is just a convention. We could type this in lowercase, and that's perfectly fine. So let's revert it back. Now, right after this, we need to use our HTML elements to define the structure of this web page. The first element we're going to use is the HTML element. So we type HTML and then press Tab or Enter. Once again, VS Code generated this piece of code for us. So what we have here on the left side is called the opening tag, and what we have on the right side is the closing tag. So most HTML elements have an opening and a closing tag, but there are exceptions as I'm going to show you later in this video. Now, inside this element, we're going to add additional elements. Now, because I don't want to type everything in one line, I'm going to press Enter. That's better. Now here we're going to add two elements, head and body. So once again, we type head, press Tab, good, and then body. We use the head element to give browser information about this page. For example, here we can use the title element to specify the title of this page that appears in the browser over here. So let's type my first web page. Now let's save the changes by pressing Command and S on Mac or Control and S on Windows. Good. Now before going any further, let's right-click somewhere and go to Open with Live Server. So we're going to open this page using the development server that we just installed. Okay. All right, take a look. So our page is currently empty because we haven't added any elements inside this page. And over here, we can see the title that we just typed, my first web page. Now look at the URL or address of this page. We have 127.0.0.1. This number or this IP address represents the local computer. It's globally known, so everybody knows 127.0.0.1 references the current computer. After that, we have a colon, and then we have the port number on which our web server is listening. So our web server is waiting for HTTP requests on this port. Okay? Then we have a / followed by the name of our file, index.html. Now, back to VS Code. Inside the body element, we're going to add elements that would appear on our page. So let's say we want to display a tweet. What elements do we need here? An image and some text elements. So we type img, short for image, and then press Tab. Here's our image element. Now this image element is different from the other elements we have created so far. Can you tell the differences? There are two differences here. The first difference is that here we don't have a closing tag. We only have an opening tag because the image element cannot have any child elements. That's the reason. Now in the previous versions of HTML, we used to add a / here, and this represents a self-closing tag. But we don't have to do this in HTML5, so I'm going to keep the code simpler. Now, here we have two attributes, source and alt. With these attributes, we can supply additional information about an element. So we use the source element to specify the path to our image. So let's open up the Explorer panel one more time by pressing Command and B on Mac or Control and B on Windows. Here I'm going to create a new folder called Images. Now for this demo, I'm going to use my own image, which you can also download right below this video, but you can use any image that you want. So here's my image. I'm going to drop it onto the Images folder. It's right here, okay? Now let's close this window. Good. So where is this image relative to our index.html file? It's inside the Images folder, right? So here in double quotes, we type images/mosh.jpg. Now VS Code is suggesting this name, so we can press Tab to complete the code. Beautiful. Now alt is short for alternative text, and we use this attribute to give the browser some text to display in case the image cannot be displayed. We'll talk about this in more detail in the future. So for now, I'm going to delete this attribute. Good. Now, after the image, we're going to add a text element. So we type P, that is short for paragraph, tab, and here we can type my Twitter handle. So at Mosh Hamadani. After that, we're going to add another text element, and here we can type the body of our tweet. So I love to teach you HTML. Perfect. Save the changes. Now, back in the browser, our page refreshed automatically. This is one of the beauties of Live Server. So we don't have to manually refresh the page every time we make changes. Now, look at what we have here. So we have my image, and right below that, we have two text elements. Take a look. Unfortunately, they're not very visible. Obviously, this doesn't look like a tweet because we haven't applied CSS yet. As I told you before, we use HTML to define the structure or the building block of our web pages. In the next lesson, I'm going to show you how to apply CSS so our page looks kind of like a real tweet. Alright, now let's see how we can use CSS to improve the look and feel of this page. Look at our head element. Currently, we have a single element inside the head element. That is our title element, right? Now, after the title, we're going to add another element called style. This is where we're going to write our CSS code. So in between style tags, we're going to write a bunch of CSS rules. First, we're going to work on this image. Our image is currently too big. So let's make it a bit smaller. Back to VS Code. Over here, we're going to type img to reference our image element. Then we type a pair of curly braces. And inside the braces, we write one or more CSS declarations. Each declaration contains a property and a value. So here we can set the width property to, let's say, 100 pixels. So we type the property, colon, and then the value. And then we terminate this line using a semicolon. So we can write multiple CSS declarations. Now let's save the changes. Back in the browser, our image looks smaller. That's a lot better. But look at the edges. The edges are so sharp. I would like to make them a bit round so they appear softer. Now back to our rule. Here we're going to set the border dash radius property to, let's say, 10 pixels. Now don't worry about memorizing any of these properties. We're going to go over them several times throughout the course. In this lesson, I just want you to get a sense of what it's like to use CSS. Okay? So save the changes. Now look, the edges are round and look softer. Now let me show you a trick. If we set border radius to a value that is half of the width, we will get a round image. So I'm going to set this to 50 pixels. And here's the result. That's a lot better. Now our elements are stacked vertically. I want the image to be pushed to the left side. So let's set the float property to left. This will push the image element to the left side of our text elements. Take a look. So that's a lot better, but our image is so close to the text. I want to add some space after the image. So here we use another property called margin-right. We can set it to 10 pixels. Save, and that's a lot better. Now let's make the username bold. So we're going to repeat one more time. This time we're going to apply a rule to our paragraph element. So here we're going to set the font-weight property to bold. Take a look. See what happened? Both our text elements are bold. But what if you want to apply this style only to the username? Well, we have to separate these two paragraph elements. So I'm going to give the first paragraph element an attribute called class. So class equals double quotes. Class is short for classification, and we can use this attribute to put this element inside a different class or a different category, just like the products in a supermarket. In a supermarket, we have products in different categories, right? So I'm going to put this paragraph element inside a class or inside a category called username. And then I'm going to change this rule. So this rule is currently applied to all paragraph elements, but I want it to be applied only to paragraph elements with the username class. So right after P, we type dot username. Now we can also remove P, and this rule will apply to all elements that have the username class, whether they are paragraph elements or other types of elements. Okay? Now save the changes and take a look. So That's a lot better. So this is CSS in action. As you can see, CSS has a different syntax or a different grammar than HTML. Throughout the rest of the course, you're going to learn both these languages in detail. Next, I'm going to show you how to format your code using Prettier. One thing you need to know about browsers is that they ignore white spaces in HTML and CSS code. For example, I can put all these elements on a single line, and everything still works. Let me show you. So save the changes. Back in the browser, we have the same result as before. Because browsers don't care how we format our code. But formatting is very important when it comes to reading and maintaining code. We want our code to be beautiful and perfectly formatted, just like an article. This is where we use the Prettier plugin. With Prettier, we can format our code in a consistent fashion. This is super important when you're part of a team, because different people have different ways of formatting their code. But if everyone on the team uses the Prettier plugin, the code will be consistently formatted. So let me show you how to use Prettier. On the top, we go to the View menu. Look at the shortcut for the command palette. On Mac, it's Shift, Command, and P. On Windows, it's probably Shift, Control, and P. So let's bring up the command palette, and here we search for Format Document. Now we press Enter. We get this message saying there are multiple formatters for HTML files. Select the default formatter to continue. The reason we're getting this message is that VS Code by default comes with a formatter for formatting HTML files, but we have installed Prettier, which is a separate formatter. So let's go to Configure and tell VS Code to use Prettier to format HTML and CSS files. Okay, now Prettier formatted my code, so none of those elements are on the same line. This is a lot better. But let me show you a trick. We don't want to format our code every time we make a change. So we can configure VS Code to automatically format the code the moment we save the changes. So on the top, let's go to the Code menu, then Preferences and Settings. And here, search for Format and Save. Here's the setting. Let's enable this setting. Now, every time we save the changes, VS Code automatically formats our code using Prettier. Earlier we talked about the DOM or Document Object Model. I told you that when the browser reads the HTML document that is returned from the server, it constructs a Document Object Model. Now let me show you this Document Object Model in action. So once again, we're going to use Chrome DevTools. The shortcut on Mac is Shift, Command, and I. On Windows, it's probably Shift, Control, and I. I'm not really sure. So let's open up DevTools. Now in this lesson, we're going to look at the Elements tab. Now what we have here on the left side is our Document Object Model. So we see the same elements that we created earlier in the course. We have the HTML element, head, body, and so on. But we have some additional elements that are injected by Live Server. For example, we have the script element and 2 divs. Don't worry about these. These are purely used by Live Server, so it automatically reloads our page. Now we can hover over any of these elements, and you can see that element highlighted on the screen. Now we can click an element, and on the right side, we can see the styles applied to this element. So look at the styles we defined for the image element, width, border radius, and so on. We can enable or disable these styles. So we can disable the width property, and now our image is big. We can bring it back. We can also change its value. So we can set it to, let's say, 50 pixels. Now our image is smaller. We can use the up and down arrows to change this value. This is pretty handy. So a lot of front-end developers use DevTools to play with these styles and get the look they want. Once they figure out the exact styles and their values, then they apply them in the code. Now, one more thing. Over here, we can see where these styles have been applied. So, in index.html on line 6, we can click on this link, and this takes us to the exact line of code where we wrote that style. Now, we are currently on the Sources tab, so we can go back to Elements and inspect other elements. So this is the basics of inspecting elements using DevTools. We're going to talk about this in more detail in the future. The last thing we're going to cover in this section is validation. So as we write code, we may run into problems. If you have a typo in our code or don't use the right syntax or grammar, our web pages may not look as expected. In these situations, we can use a validator to identify the potential errors in our code. Like currently, we don't have any problems on this web page. It looks perfectly fine to me, but let's run it by the standard HTML validator. So we go to validator.w3.org. This is a standard markup validation service. We have 3 methods for validating our HTML markup. We can validate by an address if our website is live on the internet, but this doesn't work for us because our website is currently hosted locally in our development server. So this IP address that we have over here, 127.0.0.1, this is a local IP address, so no one else can access our website. So here we have 2 other methods. We can validate by file upload or by direct input. In this case, I'm going to go with file upload. So let's upload our index.html file and check. So look, we have 1 warning and 2 errors. The warning is saying that we haven't added the lang or language attribute to the HTML start tag. This is a common best practice because with this we can tell search engines what is the language of this web page, so they can do a better job at displaying the results. This is very easy to fix. So here's our HTML tag. We're going to add the lang attribute and set it to EN, which is short for English. Now, what is next? We have an error saying the character encoding was not declared. Don't worry about this. We'll talk about this in the next section. So let's look at the second error. It's saying that an image element must have an alt attribute. So earlier we had this alt attribute. I told you that we use the alt attribute to provide a description for our image. So if the image cannot be displayed, the alternative text will be displayed. Again, we're going to talk about the alt attribute in more detail in the future. So back to our code. Let's fix this error real quick. Here's our image tag. Let's add the alt attribute. And for the description, I'm going to say an image of Mosh Hamedani. Now save the changes. Let's re-upload the file and validate it one more time. Okay, this time we have only a single error, and that has to do with character encoding, which we're going to talk about in the next section. So this is all about HTML validation. Now for CSS, we have a different validator. So we go to jigsaw.w3.org/CSS-validator. Now you don't have to memorize this address. Simply go to Google and search for CSS validator. Here's the first link. So we have the same interface. We can validate our CSS code using an address or by file upload or direct input. Now in this case, we have embedded all of our CSS code inside our HTML markup. But as our web pages get more complex, we want to separate our CSS code into separate files so our code is better organized. We'll talk about this in more detail in the future. So for now, I'm going to copy all of our CSS code and then go to the third tab, paste it over here, and validate it. So we don't have any errors. Everything is perfect. So this is all about validation. Validation is very important. If your web pages aren't displayed as expected, always start with a quick validation because this can often point you in the right direction. Right, that brings us to the end of this section. In the next section, we're going to explore HTML in more detail. We're going to continue our web development journey and explore HTML in more detail. So in this section, we're going to cover the essential HTML elements you need to know to build web pages. You will learn all the elements used for displaying text, links, images, lists, tables, as well as container and structural or semantic elements. Even if you know the basics of HTML, I would still encourage you to watch this section thoroughly because a lot of people don't use these elements the right way. So let's jump in and get started. Earlier in the course, I told you that we use the head section to give browsers and search engines information about a web page. So let's explore it in a bit more detail. I'm going to start with a blank document. Now let me show you a cool trick. If we type an exclamation mark and then press tab, we get a basic HTML boilerplate, which means a basic HTML template. So on the top, we have our doc type declaration. Below that, we have our HTML element with the lang attribute, which is a common best practice. Next, we have our head section with a bunch of elements we're going to talk about in a second, followed by the body section. So this is a very basic HTML boilerplate. Now, what do we have in the head section? Well, we have a couple of meta elements for giving information about this web page. The first meta element is for defining the character set. What is a character set? Well, computers don't understand characters like A, B, C, and so on. They only understand numbers which are represented in the binary format, zeros and ones. So using a character set, we can map a character to a numeric value. The first character set that was designed was the ASCII character set, which is short for American Standard Code for Information Interchange. ASCII can only represent the characters in the English language, so it's very limited. So over here, different character sets have been created to represent more characters in international languages. The character set that we use most of the time these days is UTF-8, which can represent almost all characters in the world. So back to our code. With this meta element, we're defining the character set used in this HTML document. Okay? Now, below that we have a meta element for configuring the viewport. The viewport is the visible area of a web page. So, it is this area over here. Obviously, on a mobile device or on a tablet, our viewport is smaller. But here on desktop, we can change the size of the viewport by resizing the browser. So now, our viewport is smaller. Okay? Now back to our code. With this element, we're defining the initial width and zoom factor for the viewport. We'll talk about this in more detail in the future. For now, all I want you to know is that we need this element so our web pages look good on all devices, mobiles, tablets, and desktop computers. So as a best practice, every web page should have at least these two meta elements. But we have additional meta elements. Let me show you. So if you type meta, in this list, you can see all possible meta elements. For example, we have this element for defining keywords on a web page. So let's select this. Here we can type multiple keywords like HTML, CSS, and so on. In the past, these keywords were heavily used for search engine optimization, but these days, most search engines don't put too much weight on these keywords, but we can still use them to define the keywords that represent this page. We have another meta element for defining a description for this page. So if you type meta:desk and then press tab or enter, here we can type a description for this page. What we type here will appear on Google or other search engines when someone searches for a website. For example, if we search for Apple, here's what we get. Now look at this text. What you see here comes from this element over here. So this is the purpose of meta elements. With these meta elements, we can give information about a web page. All right, next we're going to talk about the elements you need to know for working with text. All right, now let's talk about the most common elements for working with text. So you learn about the P or paragraph element, which we use for displaying some text. So here I'm going to say, I love to teach you HTML. Now sometimes we want to emphasize a part of our text. Let's say the HTML word here. To do that, we can wrap it inside an M or emphasis element. So here I type M, press tab. Here's the emphasis element. Let's hover over it and see what the tooltip says. It says the M element represents stress emphasis of its content. So whenever we want to emphasize some content, we can wrap it inside the M element. So in this case, I'm going to move HTML inside these tags. Now, let's save the changes. Here's what we get. So by default, browsers display emphasized content in italic. But don't assume that whenever you want to display italic content, you should use the M element. Because the purpose of the M element is to emphasize content in our HTML document. And this helps search engines extract important content in our documents. Anything to do with styling should be done in CSS. For example, here we can change the default style of emphasized elements and remove the italic. Let me show you. So in the head section, we add the style element. And here we define a rule for emphasized content. We can set the color to red and font style to normal. Now don't worry about memorizing any of these CSS properties. We're going to go over them multiple times throughout the course. But let's see what happens now that we apply these styles. So our emphasized content is displayed in red and is no longer italic. Now in the past we had an element called I, which was short for italic. If we use this element, we get the same result as before. Our content is displayed in italic. But this element is considered deprecated because HTML is not meant for styling. It should only be used for structuring content. So don't use the I element to display content as italic, okay? Now we have a similar element in HTML called strong. Let's hover over it and see what the tooltip says. The strong element represents strong importance, seriousness, or urgency of its contents. Conceptually, it's kind of similar to the emphasis element. So where you should use it really depends on your context, on your content. Now let's save the changes and see what we get. So by default, strong elements are displayed as bold. But once again, we can always change the styling. Now in the past, we had another element called B, which is short for bold. So whenever we wanted to make something bold, we use this element. But once again, this element is considered deprecated because styling should be done in CSS and not in HTML, okay? So don't use B or I elements. Now, I'm going to remove this element and just add HTML. Let me show you a cool trick. Let's say we want to wrap this word with the M element. There is a shortcut for it. So on the top, we go to the View menu. Look at the shortcut for the command palette. On Mac is Shift, Command, and P, and on Windows is probably Shift, Control, and P. So let's select HTML, and then bring up the command palette. With this command palette, we can execute commands in VS Code. So here I'm going to search for a command called wrap with abbreviation. That is the first command on the list. Now we press Enter, and here we type the element that we want to use to wrap our selected content. In this case, M. Press Enter, done. So I didn't have to manually create an M element and then move HTML inside it. It's very handy. So this is all about text. Now let's talk about headings. So in HTML, we have 6 heading elements. H1, we have H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6. So let's see what we get. So heading 1 represents the most important heading, and heading 6 represents the least important heading. Now, one common mistake that I see amongst a lot of people is that they choose these headings based on their size. So if they want to have a heading with this size, they would just use heading 4. That is not how you're supposed to use headings, because the size can always be changed with CSS. It's a matter of styling. We should use these headings to create a hierarchy. So every web page should have one and only one H1 element. This heading represents what this page is all about. Now, nothing happens if you have multiple H1 elements. For example, I can duplicate this line and say heading 1 plus. Now look, we have 2 H1 elements, but this is going to confuse search engines. They're not going to figure out what this page is really all about. So every page should have a single H1 element. So I'm going to remove this line. Now, after we use H1, then we should use H2. We should not jump to H4. So let's say on this page, we're going to have 2 sections, one for HTML, the other for CSS. So my next heading should be H2. And here we can type HTML. Obviously, below this heading, we can have some text. So I'm going to say HTML tutorial. Our next heading should be H2. So this is the CSS section. And in this section, we can have some additional text. Let's say CSS tutorial. Now I'm going to delete these 4 headings. So let's take a look. So we have a hierarchy. On the top, we have an H1 element. Below that, we have 2 H2 elements. Now let's say in this section, we're going to have 2 subsections. There we should use H3 elements. So here's our HTML section. In this section, we're going to have 2 H3 elements. Let's say code and exercise. Now take a look. So we have a hierarchy. This is how we should use these heading elements. The better we can represent the structure of our document using HTML, the better search engines can read and understand our content. So that's all about text. Next, we're going to talk about displaying special characters in HTML. some characters are reserved in HTML, and to display them, we have to use a special notation. For example, let's say we want to wrap the word HTML with angle brackets. See what's going to happen. So I type a left angle bracket and a right angle bracket. See what happened? VS Code thought we were adding an HTML element, so it automatically generated the closing tag. We don't want this, so let's delete it. Now, back in the browser, look, where's our HTML word? It's not here because the browser interpreted this as an HTML tag. This is not what we want. We want to display this exactly as is. So to solve this problem, we're going to use HTML entities. All these entities start with an ampersand and end with a semicolon. In between these two characters, we type a few characters that determine the type of the HTML entity. So we have an entity for displaying the less than sign. That is LT, short for less than. Now let's remove this. Similarly, we have another HTML entity for displaying the greater than sign. So we type an ampersand, GT, which is short for greater than, followed by a semicolon. Now, back to the browser. That's exactly what we wanted. Perfect. Another common HTML entity is the copyright symbol. So, at the end, I'm going to type an ampersand, copy, and a semicolon. Now, take a look. Here's our copyright symbol. Beautiful. Now, we have so many entities in HTML, and quite frankly, you don't need to memorize any of them. In fact, you're not going to use 99% of them. But in case you're curious, let me show you the complete list. So, on Google, search for HTML entities. And on this second link, dev.w3.org, you can see the complete list of these entities. So, as you can see, there are so many entities, and honestly, I have never used any of them. The only ones I have used are these three plus non-breaking space. Let me show you what that is about. So I'm going to delete this line and generate some dummy text. So we add a paragraph element. Now to generate some dummy text, we type lorem, followed by the number of words we want to generate. Let's say 50. Tab. Look, this is some dummy text in Latin. Now let's preview it in the browser. So here's what we get. Let's imagine that the last word on the first line and the first word on the second line should be stick together. Here we have a line break in between these two words. We want to prevent that. So I'm going to copy this word. Now, here in VS Code, let's bring up the search panel by pressing Command and F on Mac or Control and F on Windows. Now we paste this word. Okay, here it is. We want to make sure that these two words are always together. There is no line break in between them. So I'm going to replace this regular space with a non-breaking space, which is an HTML entity. So we type an ampersand, NBSP, which is short for non-breaking space, followed by a semicolon. Now take a look. So both these words are on the second line. So this is all about HTML entities. Next, we're going to talk about links. Almost every web page on the internet has links to other pages or websites. To create these links, we use the anchor element. So we type A, that is short for anchor, and then press tab. Now every anchor element should have an href attribute. Href is short for hypertext reference. I know, it's a mouthful. It basically means a URL or a link. So for this demo, I'm going to create a second page called about.html and then link to it over here. So here in the Explorer panel, let's add a new page called about.html. Now here we're going to create a basic HTML boilerplate. Remember how to do that? We type an exclamation mark and then press tab. That's it. Beautiful. Now back to index.html. Here we can use a relative or an absolute URL. What do you mean by that? Well, a relative URL starts from the current page. So currently we are on index.html and we want to go to about.html. Now, currently both these pages are in the same folder. So we can type a relative URL to about.html like this, about.html. That's a relative URL. Now, what if about.html was in a different folder? So let's add a new folder to our project called company, and then move about to this folder. Now, where is about.html relative to the current page? It's inside the company folder, right? So here we type company/about.html. This is a relative URL. Now let's give this link a text. I'm going to say about me. So we type our text inside the anchor element. Okay. Save the changes. Back to the browser. Here's our link. Click. And we're currently on the About page, which is empty. Beautiful. Now, back to our home page. Instead of a text, we can also use an image. So I'm going to delete About Me and add an image element. So img tab. Once again, here we can type a relative URL to our target image. So I'm going to go with images/mosh.jpg. Now save. Take a look. Obviously, this image is way too big. We can always use CSS to resize it. But that aside, look at the mouse icon when we hover over this image. It changed to a hand to indicate that this image is clickable. Okay? Now, back to our code. To keep things simple, I'm going to get rid of this image and get back to our text, About Me. Now let's go to the About page and add a link back to the home page. So, over here, we're going to add an anchor element. What should we type for the href attribute? Well, currently we are inside the company folder. We have to go one level up so we can access index.html, right? To do that, we type double periods and a /. With this, we can go one level up. Now, at this level, which is the root of our website, we have the company folder, the images folder, and index.html. So we can reference index.html. And for the text, we're going to say homepage. Again, this is another example of a relative URL because it starts from the current page and goes somewhere else. Now, if we're inside a deeply nested folder structure, we might have to go multiple levels up. So double period and a /, then we repeat and repeat. With this, we can go 3 levels up. Now, as you can see, URLs like this kind of look messy. They look hard to read. In those cases, we can use an absolute URL. So we start with a /, and this represents the root of our website. Now, at this level, we have access to index.html. So this is an absolute URL, okay? Now, back to index.html. Here we are linking to an HTML document, but we can also link to non-HTML documents like images, PDFs, PowerPoints, and so on. So let's add a link to my image. So for the href, I'm going to say images/mosh.jpg. And for the text, I'm going to say my photo. Save. Take a look. So here's our second link. Click. My image is displayed in the browser. But what if I want to prompt the user to download it? That's very easy. We're going to add the download attribute to our anchor element. So we type download, press enter. Now this attribute doesn't have a value, so we can remove the double quotes and the equal sign. So we just add the attribute name. Now save. Back to the browser. We go back. Here we have to manually refresh the page because the live server only refreshes the current page. Now previously we were on my image, so that was the URL that live server refreshed. So here we refresh to get the latest changes. Now when I click on this link, instead of seeing my image, we're going to see my image getting downloaded. Take a look. Click, and here's my image. Beautiful. Now we can also link to other parts of this page. So let's create 2 sections with a lot of text. So I'm going to add an H2 element. Of course, I missed the H1, but let's not worry about it. For this H2, we're going to say HTML. And below that, we're going to add some dummy text with 200 words. So paragraph, lorem, 200. Good. Now right after that, we're going to add another H2 for the CSS section with some more text. Okay. Let's save the changes. Take a look. As you can see, the CSS section is below the fold. So we have to scroll down to see it. What we can do here is on the top, we can add a link to the CSS section. So when the user clicks on that, they will immediately jump to the CSS section. That is very easy. So here's the CSS section. First, we have to give this element a unique identifier. Just like everyone in the real world can have a unique identifier, like a driver's license or a passport, every element on a page can also have a unique identifier. So here I'm going to set the ID attribute to CSS, or we can use a more descriptive name like section-CSS. The name doesn't really matter here. What matters is that we're defining what is called a fragment or a place on this page. Now, we're going to add a link to this fragment. So on the top, let's add another anchor element. Now for the href, we're going to type a # followed by the name of our fragment, which is section-css. And for the text, we're going to say CSS. Now, back to the browser, take a look. I'm going to click on this. We immediately jump to the CSS section. Beautiful. Now, a lot of websites like this also have a link that helps you jump to the top of the page. Let's see how we can create that. So after the CSS section, I'm going to add another anchor element. Now for the href, I'm going to use an empty fragment. So we just type a # without an identifier. And then we say jump to top. Take a look. So here's our link. Click, and now we're on top of the page. Now let's see how we can link to external websites. So let's add another anchor element to link to Google. Now what should we type here? Well, google.com is a different website. So here we cannot use a relative URL. We have to use an absolute URL. But if you start with a /, we're referencing the root of our website. But in this case, we want to go to a different website. How can we do that? Well, we have to start with the protocol. So https://google.com. Now let's type Google and test our page. Click. We're on Google. Beautiful. Now sometimes when linking to external websites, we want that link to open in a new browser window or a new tab. Let me show you how to do that. So here's our anchor. We set the target attribute to _blank. Save. Now, back to the home page. Once again, we have to manually refresh to get the latest changes. Okay. Now, when I click on Google, you see a new tab. Beautiful. And one last thing. We can also link to emails. So I'm going to add an anchor. And for href, I'm going to say mail to : programmingwithmosh@gmail.com. Email me. Save the changes. Now, back to our page. When I click on this link, my mail client will open and my email address will be pre-populated. Take a look. So click, and here's my mail client. So this is all about links. Now, one last thing before we finish this lesson. What is the difference between a link and a hyperlink? Well, a link is just an address, a URL, the location of the target page. A hyperlink is the element that the user can click on to navigate to that target page. That is the difference between a link and a hyperlink. But quite often, these terms are used interchangeably. All right, we're done with this lesson. Next, we're going to talk about images. All right, now let's talk about embedding images in a bit more detail. For this lesson, I'm going to grab an image from unsplash.com, which is where we can find a lot of beautiful and freely usable images. So let's search for coffee. There are tons of coffee pictures here. I'm going to grab this picture. We can download it for free. Now look, this image comes in different sizes, small, medium, and large. For now, we're going to grab this image in a small size. But in the future, we're going to talk about embedding images at different sizes depending on the device. So on mobile devices, we want to serve a smaller image, and on desktop computers, we want to serve a larger image. For now, let's not worry about these complexities. We'll have a complete section on this topic later on. So let's download the small image. Now it says, say thank you to Nathan. Thanks, Nathan. This is a beautiful picture. You have done a great job. Now I'm going to drag and drop this image onto the images folder, and then rename it to coffee. We want to give it a descriptive name. This is a small search engine optimization tip. When we provide descriptive names for our images, search engines can better understand and index our pages. Okay? So here's our image. Now, let's add an image element. We set the source to images/coffee.jpg. Now, what about the alt attribute? Well, I briefly mentioned that we use this attribute to provide textual description of the image. It's not compulsory, but is highly recommended for a number of reasons. The first reason is to make our page accessible to visually impaired people. These people use a screen reader to read the web out to them. So with this alternative text, we can tell them what we are showing on the page. And that means we should write a good, meaningful description here, like a coffee mug on a table. Don't write something like image or image1. That is pointless. Now, the second benefit of providing an alternative text is that we help search engines read this text and understand what we're providing here. And there's one more benefit. If this image cannot be loaded for some reason, the alternative text is shown. Let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to add a typo here. Now, back to the browser. Look, the image is not loaded, but we see the alternative text. This can also happen if there is a network connectivity issue. If the user gets disconnected, they can still see the alternative text. So let's remove the typo. Now let's talk about sizing images. As I told you before, we can use CSS to resize our images. So here in the head section, let's add a style element and apply a rule to our image. Now this rule is applied to all images on the page. This is probably not something we want to do in a real-world scenario. In a real-world scenario, we want to apply a class to this element and then define rules for that class. We'll talk about this in more detail in the future. So for now, let's give this image a width of 200 pixels and a height of 200 pixels. Now, there's a tiny problem in our image. Can you tell? Our image is kind of squashed. Here's the reason. We're dealing with a rectangular image. Look, this is a rectangular image, but we're converting it to a square image. And look at the shape of this coffee mug. It's kind of round, right? Like compared with what we have over here. Our image is vertically squashed. Let me show you another way to verify this. We can right-click on the image and then go to Inspect. This opens Chrome DevTools and selects our image in the DOM. Now, on the right side, we can see the styles that we apply to this element. Now, I'm going to disable the height property, and I want you to pay close attention to the image and see how the shape changes. So, look. Now, the coffee mug is more round, but if I apply the height property, it becomes squashed. So how can we solve this problem? Well, we have a new property in CSS called Object Fit. So here we can set Object Fit to one of these values. Most of the time we use cover, so the image covers its containing box. What is this containing box? Well, first let me set this to cover. Here we have this image element, right? Conceptually, there is a box around every element in an HTML document. We don't see this box, but the browser uses that box to figure out how the page should be displayed. So here we have a box with this dimension, 200 by 200. And in this box, we're trying to insert this image, right? Now, when we set Object Fit to cover, our image will get resized and potentially cropped so it covers the entire containing box. Let's verify this. So save the changes and back in the browser. Look, our coffee mug is round, but if I disable the Object Fit property, it gets squashed again. So Object Fit is a very useful property. Now we can always play with all possible values over here. So I'm going to select this, delete it. Now using the up and down arrows, we can go through this list and see the impact of every value. Now I'm not going to go over all these values and explain what they mean. This is pointless. You can always figure them out on your own. Just remember that most of the time we use cover. So the image covers the entire containing box. All right, this is all about the images for now. Next, we're going to talk about video and audio. In HTML5, we have great support for embedding video and audio. Here's a real example. On Sketch.com, we can see a video showcasing how this tool works. Now, this video doesn't have any control buttons like play and pause, but we can easily add them. So let me show you how to embed video and audio in your web pages. For this lesson, we're going to go to pexels.com. This is another website where you can find plenty of beautiful free photos and videos. So I'm going to search for ocean. And then on the top, select videos. So let's grab this video over here. Now, just like on splash.com, we can download this video for free at different sizes. For this lesson, I'm going to download the HD version, which is smaller. We don't want to embed a large video file because if the user is on a slow connection, they're going to have a really bad experience watching the video. So let's download the smallest version. And of course, we should say thanks to Ruvim or Ravim, I don't know how to say their name, and I'm going to send them a donation right after this video. So here's our video file. Now in our project, I'm going to create a new folder called Videos, and then drag and drop this new video into this folder. Now let's rename this to Ocean, so the name is more descriptive. Now, back to index.html. To embed a video, use the video element. Now, just like the image element, here we have the source attribute. So we set it to video/ocean.mp4. So once again, we have a relative URL, but we could also use an absolute URL that starts with a /. Now, let's save the changes and see what we get. All right, here's what we get. By default, we just see an image of the video, and this image is shown at the full size, which is larger than my browser window over here. So we have horizontal scrolling, which is really bad. So let's use CSS to change the size of this video. Here in the head section, we add a style element and define a rule for our video. I'm going to set the width to 400 pixels. Now, we don't have to set the height here. The browser will automatically calculate the height based on the aspect ratio of the video. So here's what we get. That's a lot better. Now let's add the control buttons. Now, to show the control buttons, all we have to do is to apply the controls attribute. This attribute is what we call a Boolean attribute. If you have done any programming, you probably know Boolean values, which can be true or false. Now, a lot of people have a misconception about Boolean attributes in HTML. They assume that they can set these attributes to true or false. Well, that is not correct. Here's the reason. If we set this to false, the browser will still show the control buttons. Let's verify this. So save, and back in the browser, here's the play button. We can also change the volume, we can make this full screen, and so on. So this is not the way Boolean attributes work in HTML. The presence of a Boolean attribute represents the true value, and its absence represents the false value. So all we have to do to show the control buttons is to add the attribute. The value we set is irrelevant. Now we have another Boolean attribute called autoplay. As the name suggests, when we apply this attribute, the video automatically starts when our page is loaded. This is exactly like the video you saw on sketch.com. The video automatically started without me explicitly playing it. Another useful Boolean attribute you should know is loop. When we apply this attribute, the video will automatically loop. So this is how we can embed video in our web pages. Now, these days, most browsers have excellent support for the video element, but there is still one browser that doesn't support the video element. Let me show you. We go to caniuse.com. On this website, we can find out how different browsers support various HTML and CSS features. So let's search for video. Now, the first item here is video tracks, which is used for displaying subtitles. Now look at this table. We have a lot of red boxes, which means the majority of browsers out there don't support this feature. So let's move on and look at the video element. We have a lot of green boxes, only a few red boxes. For example, Firefox version 2 or 3 don't support this feature. But this is a really old browser. It was mainly used between 2006 and 2008. Now look at the total usage of this browser in the world. It's 0.01%. Really, really low. So I'm not worried about this browser. All the other versions of Firefox have perfect support for the video element. The only browser that doesn't support the video element is Opera Mini, which was released in 2015, and currently it's used by 0.88% of the users in the world. I'm not personally familiar with this browser, but what we need to do with our video element is to provide a fallback text if their browser doesn't support the video element. So back to the code, inside the video element, we can provide our fallback text and say, your browser doesn't support videos. This is a common best practice. Now, what about audio? Well, we have another element for adding audio. It's exactly like the video element. So we specify the source, and we also have these Boolean attributes. So that's all about video and audio. Next, we're going to talk about lists. Okay, now let's talk about adding lists. In HTML, we have three types of list elements. The type that we use most of the time is UL, which is short for unordered list. We use this element whenever we want to show a list of items where the order doesn't matter. A common application of this element is in implementing navigation menus. Quite often, these navigation menus are represented using unordered lists. But we can use unordered lists for listing any type of objects where the order doesn't matter. We can list images, products in a shopping cart, and so on. So for this demo, let's say we want to create a navigation menu with 4 links. Inside this UL element, we add 4 LI elements. LI is short for list item. So the first item is going to be about me. Now here I'm using plain text, but we can add a hyperlink using the anchor element. Let's not worry about that and just focus on this structure. So let's add another list item, say courses, subscribe, and contact me. Let's see what we get. So by default, list items are displayed using bullet points. But these bullet points are a matter of styling. We can change their shape, we can change circles to squares, or we can remove them. That's something we do in CSS. Let me show you. So here in the style element, let's define a rule for our unordered list. Here we set list style type to a square. And with this, the shape of our bullet points changed to a square. Now, if you want to remove these, we set this property to none. The bullet points are gone. We can also use CSS to lay these out horizontally, just like this navigation menu over here. But that's a matter of styling. We'll talk about that later in the course. In this section, our focus is mainly on HTML for structuring our web pages. So this is how we can create an unordered list. Now we can also nest lists to create a hierarchy. For example, let's say here I want to display 3 of my courses in another unordered list. So after courses, we add another unordered list, and inside this list, we're going to have 3 list items. Now let me show you a cool technique for quickly generating markup. We want to create 3 list items, right? So we type li times 3, and then press tab. This is called Zen coding. So let's list a few of my courses here: HTML, JavaScript, and Git. Now, here's what we get. We have a hierarchy of items. So this is all about unordered lists. Now, in contrast, we have ordered lists where the order of items matter. So if you change the order, the meaning can change. Let me show you an example. So I'm going to delete this unordered list and create an ordered list using the OL element. Now, inside this list, we're going to have 3 list items. So once again, we type li times 3. But there's a shortcut to create all of this markup in one go. So I'm going to delete all of this. So we start with an OL. Inside this OL, we're going to have 3 list items. So li times 3. Isn't that awesome? So what is a real example? Let's say we have a website for recipes. So our first item can be preheat the oven. Then we can say place the ingredients on the crust. Let's say this is a recipe for making pizzas. The third step can be put the pizza in the oven for 20 minutes, and so on. With this markup, we get this output. So instead of bullet points, we have 1, 2, 3. So this is all about ordered lists. Now we have a third type of lists called description lists. So I'm going to delete all this markup. We use description lists for implementing glossaries or display metadata. So we can have a term and some details about that term. Let me show you how this works. So we start with a DL element, which is short for description list. Now inside this list, we can have a description term, let's say HTML. And after this, we can add a description details element to describe this term. So here we can say hypertext markup language. Now after that, we can add another term, let's say CSS, followed by some details. We can say this is short for cascading style sheets. So here's the default representation of a description list. But once again, we can use CSS to lay this out in a different way. For example, we can make the term bold and bigger. We can add some padding and so on. Now you might say, but Mosh, how often do we implement glossaries? Well, let me show you another real-world application of description lists. Let's say we want to display metadata about my course. So I'm going to change HTML to course or title. And then here, I add the title of this course. What is the title of this course? The Ultimate HTML and CSS Course. The next term is author. And here we can provide details about the author, Mosh Hamedani. Then we can add another term called skills. These are the skills you're going to learn in this course. Then here we can list multiple details. So I'm going to type DD times 3. In this course, you're going to learn HTML, CSS, responsive design. Let's add another details item, search engine optimization. Now take a look. This is a real example of displaying metadata about something. So that's all about lists. Next, we're going to talk about tables. All right, let's see how we can create tables. So we have this table element for representing tabular data. In the past, we used this element for laying out pages, but these days that's considered a bad practice because we have better ways for creating layouts. We'll talk about them later in the course. So just remember, the table element should only be used for displaying tabular data, like this table over here. So in this table, we're going to have one or more rows. To define a row, we use the TR, or table row element. In this element, we can have one or more cells, which can be data cells or header cells. Let me show you the difference. So look at this table. In this table, we have a bunch of rows. In each row, we have 4 cells, 1, 2, 3, and 4. The cells in the first row are called header cells because here we have labels that define what each column represents. All the other cells in this table are called data cells because they contain data. So back to our code. In this row, we're going to have 2 data cells. To define a data cell, we use the TD element. That is short for table data cell. So in this cell, I'm going to say marketing, and let's define another cell. Here we can add the amount we spent on marketing. Let's say $100. Now let's define another row. But this time I'm going to use Zen coding. So we want a TR element. Inside this element, we want 2 TD elements. So TD times 2. Good. Now let's say accounting, and we spent $200 here. Save. So here's what we get. By default, our table doesn't have any styles. So here we don't have a border, we don't have background colors, and so on. But as you can tell, we can use CSS to style this table. So here in the style element, let's add a rule for our table element. So table, let's give this table a border. So we set border. Now here we have to type 3 values. The first value represents the thickness of the border. I want a really thin border, so I'm going to go with 1 pixel. The second value represents the style of the border. Our border can be a solid line, it can be a dashed line, or a dotted line, and so on. So I'm going to go with a solid line. Next, we specify the color of the border. For this demo, I'm going to go with, let's say, gray. Okay, now take a look. So we have a border around the table element, but we also want a border around each cell, right? So back to our CSS, let's define a style for our TD element. Now here I'm going to copy this line and then paste it. But there's a problem in this code. If tomorrow we decide to change the color or the thickness or the style of the border, we have to make that change in 2 different places, over here and over here. So duplication in code is bad. That's why we have the DRY principle in software engineering. DRY is short for don't repeat yourself. So we want to apply this style to both the table and TD elements. How? Super easy. Over here, we type a comma and then type the TD element. Now, all the styles that we define here will be applied to both these elements. And with this, we can get rid of the duplication. Good. So take a look. Here's what we get, but there's a tiny problem. Let me zoom in so you see clearly. We have some space between the borders of the neighboring cells. This looks ugly. Let me show you how to get rid of it. So back to our style, we have another property called border collapse. If we set this to collapse, this would collapse the borders in neighboring cells. Let me show you what I mean. So these 2 cells are neighbors, right? Currently, their borders are separated. Now, by applying border collapsing, these 2 borders will be collapsed into a single border. So back to our code, let's save the changes, and here's what we get. That's better. But there is another problem. We need some space around the data in each cell. Currently, our data is so close to the edges of each cell. So back to our CSS. Here we can set padding to, let's say, 5 pixels. Now we have some padding around the data in each cell. Much better. Now let's add a header to this table. So in this table, we're going to add another row. In this row, we're going to have 2 header cells. To define a header cell, use the TH element. TH is short for table header cell. So th times 2. Look, we have the same structure as before, but instead of using the td element, we are using the th element, okay? Now in the first cell, I'm going to say category, and for the second cell, I'm going to say amount. Now, here's what we get. Of course, I've zoomed in here, so what you should see actually looks like this. So don't let that confuse you. Now, pay close attention to these header cells. These header cells have a different style from our data cells. They don't have a border, and they don't have padding either. So back to our CSS, let's apply these styles to our th elements as well. Save the changes. Here's what we get. That's better. So this is the basic way of defining a table. Now, there is nothing particularly wrong with this structure, but we can improve it and make it more meaningful to search engines and screen readers. So we want to tell search engines that in this table we have two sections, a header and a body. To do that, we're going to use the thead and tbody elements. So inside the table, first we add a thead element, that is short for table head. Then we should move the first row inside the thead element. Now let me show you how to select multiple lines using keyboard. So I'm going to hold down the shift button, and then using the down or up arrows, we can select multiple lines, okay? Now that we have selected these lines, we can hold down the alt key and then press up or down arrows to move code. Much easier. So we have a header section. Next, we should define the body section. So after thead, we add tbody, and then we move these two rows inside the body section. So like this. Good. We get the same output as before, but our markup is more meaningful to search engines and screen readers. This is what we call semantic HTML. Semantic means meaningful, okay? Now, inside this thead element, we can have multiple rows. So let me add another row, and in this row, I just want to add one cell, one header cell. Let's say expenses. So let's take a look. Here's our new cell, but what if I want to expand this cell so it goes up to here? That is very easy. Here's our header cell. In this element, we set the col span attribute to 2. Col span is short for column span, and it determines how many columns this cell should expand to. The default value is 1, but here we're saying 2, so this cell should take 2 columns. Now, take a look. That's better. So we have a header with 2 rows and a body. Now, optionally, we can add a footer. So after the tbody element, we add a tfoot element, and in this element, we add one row with 2 header cells. So tr greater than th times 2. In the first cell, I'm going to say total, and in the second cell, I'm going to say $300. Take a look. So that's our footer, and once again, we can have multiple rows in the footer to summarize data in different ways. Now, I have a question for you. What are the differences between header and data cells in terms of styling? Pause the video and think about it for a couple of seconds. Here's the answer. In header cells, by default, our text is bold and aligned in the center. In contrast, in data cells, our text is aligned to the left. But in this case, I want to align 300 to the left, so it perfectly aligns with these other numbers. How do we do that? Super easy. Back to our CSS, we want to define a rule for the tfoot element. Here I'm going to set text align to left. And now, all the cells in the footer are aligned to the left. Quite often we need to group a bunch of elements for styling purposes. For example, here on adobe.com, look at this navigation bar on the top. In this navigation bar, we have an image and a bunch of menu items. So this navigation bar is a container for these elements. Here's another example. This is what we call a hero unit. This hero unit has a background image, a heading, some text, and a couple links. Here are more examples. Another container, and so on. So containers are used quite a lot in web pages. Let me show you how you can work with them. So in HTML, we have a few different container elements. The one that is most commonly used is the div or division element. Now this element doesn't have any visual appearance. So if we save the changes and go back to the browser, we see nothing because this is purely a container element. So Here I'm going to add a paragraph and a hyperlink. Now, let's save the changes and go back to the browser. Once again, we don't see the div. We only see the text and the hyperlink. But we can use CSS to style this div. So here in the style element, we can define a rule for our div element, but this rule will apply to all divs or all containers on this page. This is not what we want. So here we can give this div a class. Let's say product. So let's imagine here we are showcasing a product that we are selling. Now we can change this selector to div.product. Now this rule will apply to all divs with the product class. Or we can make this code shorter and more flexible by removing div. So now we have a rule that will apply to any element with the product class. So if tomorrow we decide to change this div element and replace it with another kind of container, our CSS code will still work. Okay? So here I'm going to set the background color to gold. Now, take a look. See what's happening? This div, this container, is filling up the entire width of the page, even though it has very little content. Why is this happening? Well, because the div element is a block level element. Block level elements always start on a new line and fill up the entire available space. So if we duplicate this div, the new div will appear on a new line. Let me show you how to do this. So I'm going to select these few lines. Now to duplicate these lines, we hold down the Shift, Alt, and the down arrow. Okay? Save the changes and take a look. So block level elements start on a new line and fill up the entire available space. But we can use CSS to change their width. So over here, we can set the width to 300 pixels. Now take a look. Here's what we get. That's better. So this is all about divs. Now we have another generic container element called the span element, which is often used for styling text. Let me show you how it works. So I'm going to delete all this code. Now let's add a paragraph with some text. Let's say we want to highlight the first word here. We can wrap this word with a div, give that div a class like highlight, and then define a CSS rule for setting the background color of highlight elements. So let's wrap this with a div. Now we give this element a class like highlight, and then define a rule here for elements with the highlight class. Here we can set the background color to yellow. Let's see what we get. See what happened? Can you explain why we're getting this weird layout? Because divs are block level elements. So we wrap this word with a div, and this div is filling up the entire width of the page. This is where we can use the span element. The span element is a generic container like a div, but it's not a block level element. It's an inline element, which means it's not going to take up the entire width of the page. So back to the code, we want to replace both these div tags with a span. Let me show you another useful shortcut. So I've selected this div. Now to select the second div, we can press Command and D on Mac or Control and D on Windows. Look, now we have multiple cursors. So we can replace both these tags in one go. We just type span and then press the escape button twice to disable multi-cursor editing. Okay? So now let's save the changes and back to the browser. Look, the first word is highlighted. So this is how we can use divs and spans. But in HTML5, we have a few more container elements that are more descriptive. We'll talk about them next. So as I told you, divs and spans are general purpose containers. But HTML5 introduced a few more container elements that are more descriptive or meaningful. We refer to these as semantic elements. So wherever possible, we should use these new elements instead of the generic containers like div and span, because this helps search engines better understand our pages and what they contain. In this lesson, we're going to go through some of these semantic elements, and we'll cover the rest in the next lesson. So let's say we want to represent a blog post. We can define a div, give it a class, like article or post, doesn't matter. Inside this div, we can have an h1 followed by some text. Right? Now, there's nothing particularly wrong with this structure. but we can improve it and make it more meaningful by using semantic elements. So in HTML5, we have an element for representing articles. That is the article element. So if we replace this div with the article element, we're making our markup more meaningful to search engines. Now, this article doesn't have to be a blog post or a newspaper article. It can be any independent, self-contained piece of content. For example, it could be a forum post, user-submitted comments, reviews, product cards, and so on. For example, here on adobe.com, here we can see the showcase of 3 different products. Each product card can be represented using an article element. So an article can be any independent, self-contained piece of content. Now, an article can contain 1 or more figures like images, tables, lists, and so on. So here we can have an image element, and this is perfectly fine, but we can improve this structure and make it more meaningful by wrapping this image element inside a figure element to tell search engines that this is a figure and not just a regular image. So let's bring up the command palette and use the wrap command to wrap this element inside a figure element. Here's what we get. So the figure element is just a container for figures. It doesn't have any visual characteristics, okay? Now, a figure can optionally have a caption. This caption can be above or below the figure. So here we can add a caption using the fig caption element. But unfortunately, at the time of recording this video, VS Code doesn't recognize this element. So if I press tab, it doesn't generate the tags. So here we have to use a left angle bracket, then close it here to generate these tags. So here we can say my coffee this morning. Now let's save the changes and take a look. So we don't have an image here because I didn't set the source, but you can see an example of a caption. And again, this caption can be above or below the image. So this is an application of the figure element. Now, sometimes we want to highlight our text. In the last lesson, I told you how to do this using the span element. So let's say we want to highlight this lorem. We wrap it inside a span, and then give that span a class like highlight. That's one way to do this. But in HTML5, we have a semantic element for this very reason. That is the mark element. So if you wrap this inside a mark element, we get the same result as before. Our highlighted text has a yellow background color, and we didn't have to explicitly set this color. This is the default style of marked elements. So whenever we want to highlight or mark content, we can use the mark element. Now, one last element we're going to cover in this lesson. Quite often, articles have a published date and time. So below this heading, we can have a paragraph and say published January 1st, 2021 at 5 p.m. This is perfectly fine. But we can wrap this part inside a time component to make it more semantic. So once again, VS Code doesn't recognize the time element. So here we have to manually type a left angle bracket and then close it like this. Now, let's move the date and time over here. Good. So if we save the changes, look, our date time doesn't have any visual characteristic. It's displayed like normal text. But our HTML markup better represent the structure of this page. Now here we can optionally set the datetime attribute to a machine-readable datetime. Once again, this can help search engines better extract the necessary information from this page. So here's the format that we have to follow. 2 digits for the year, a hyphen, 2 digits for the month, 2 digits for the day. Now if you have a time, we add a space, and type the time on 24-hour time clock, so 1700. Now imagine if instead of these semantic elements like article, time, mark, and figure, all we had was divs and spans. Our HTML markup wouldn't be very descriptive, right? So even though the majority of web pages on the internet are built with divs and spans, going forward, it's highly recommended to use semantic elements. We're going to cover more semantic elements in the next lesson. So we covered the basic semantic elements. Now let's look at the elements we use for structuring web pages. Pretty much most web pages have at least 3 building blocks: a header, the main content, and a footer. That's a pretty common structure. Now sometimes we can have a sidebar for advertising or other content that is not directly related to the main content. So after the main element, we can have an aside element. Now, in the header, quite often we have a navigation bar with a list of menu items. What element do we use to represent this list? We talked about this before. We use an unordered list. So here we can have an unordered list with a bunch of list items. Okay. Now, similarly, in the footer, we can have another navigation element with an unordered list. So we can have multiple navigation elements on the same page. Now, sometimes in the main area, we may have multiple sections. For example, we may have a section for showcasing the top products we're selling and another section for the testimonials. So with the section element, we can group related content. Now, every section should have a heading, which is quite often an H2, but that really depends on where we are in the hierarchy of our headings. So here we can say products. So if we don't supply this heading and validate our web page, we'll get a validation error. Now let's say here we're going to represent the top selling products. What element can we use to represent each product? We talked about this in the previous lesson. We can use an article. With the article element, we can represent any independent, self-contained piece of content. So here you might have multiple article elements. Similarly, in the testimonial section, you may have a heading and a bunch of articles. Once again, we can represent each testimonial using an article. Now, I want to clarify something. Don't assume that this is the only way to structure a web page. This is just an example so you can see the purpose of these semantic container elements. How you use them to structure your web pages really depends on what you have on those pages. For example, here we have multiple articles inside a section, but we can also have multiple sections inside an article. For example, imagine this article is representing a blog post or a newspaper article. Here we can have multiple sections. That's a perfectly valid structure. Also, the header and footer elements don't just represent the header and the footer of the page. We may use them inside a section or an article. Again, it really depends on what we're representing. So let's quickly recap. We use the main element to represent the main content of the page. And that means every page can have only one main element. If we use more than one main element and validate our web page, we'll get a validation error. We use the section element to group related content. We use the header element to represent introductory content, which can belong to the page or a section or an article. The footer element can be used in the same way. And finally, we use the aside element for representing content not directly related to the main content. We're going to continue our web development journey and explore CSS in more detail. So in this section, we're going to cover the essential CSS concepts you need to understand to build beautiful web pages. We'll talk about various ways to provide CSS. Then we'll talk about normalizing CSS so we get consistent results across different browsers. Then we're going to talk about selectors in detail. With these selectors, we can target various elements for styling. Once you understand these selectors and how they work, then we'll talk about some cool things you can do with CSS. We'll talk about colors, gradients, borders, and shadows. If you want to learn CSS well and become a ninja web developer, don't miss any lessons in this section. So let's jump in and get started. Let's talk about 3 different ways to provide styles. We can use embedded style sheets, which is what we have been doing so far. So we embed or include our styles in our HTML documents. We can also use external style sheets, which means we can write our styles in separate files. This has a couple of benefits, which we're going to talk about in a second. And we can also use inline styles, and with this, we can apply a style directly to a particular HTML element. So in this lesson, I'm going to start by creating a paragraph with 5 words. Now let's duplicate it so we have a couple of elements to work with. Next, we go to the style element and define a rule for our paragraphs. I'm going to set the color to orange, and with this, we get 2 orange paragraphs. Now, what we have here is an embedded style sheet. There are 2 problems with these style sheets. The first problem is that they're not scalable. So if we have multiple pages, it is likely that on other pages, we want our paragraphs to be orange. With this approach, we have to copy all the styles that we have here and put them on every single web page. And that means If tomorrow we decide to change the color of our paragraphs, we have to go to every single web page and make modifications. So this approach is not scalable. The second problem with this approach is that it violates a very important principle in computer science called separation of concerns. So we want to have different modules for different concerns. As we have learned so far, we use HTML to structure our web pages, and we use CSS to style them. These are two different concerns, so we should separate them. Let me give you a metaphor. Think of a supermarket. In a supermarket, we have different sections for different types of products. We have a section for fruits and vegetables and another section for cleaning products. Now imagine if you had a supermarket with only a single section. All the products were in a single section. We could never find anything in that supermarket, right? So we want to organize our code like a well-organized supermarket. This is where we use external style sheets. So we can take all these styles and put them in a separate file. So in this project, I'm going to create a new file called styles.css. You could call it anything. The name doesn't matter. But styles is a pretty common name. What matters is that the extension should be CSS. Okay? Now, let's go to index.html and copy our CSS rule. Well, I'm going to cut it and then paste it over here. So I only moved the CSS rule, not the style element. Okay? Now, let's save the changes. Back in index.html, we can get rid of the style element and instead link this HTML document to our external style sheet. To do that, we use the link element. So link tab. This element has two attributes, rel or relationship, which determines the type of resource we're linking this document to, in this case, a style sheet. The second attribute is href, which you already know about, right? So here we can type a relative or an absolute URL. In this case, I'm going to go with the relative URL. So we're currently on index.html, and our external style sheet is in the same folder. So here we can type styles.css. Now save the changes. We get the same result as before. Now one thing I want to clarify here. This link element is what we call a self-closing element. So as you can see, here we don't have opening and closing tags. We have a single tag, which is self-closed over here. The alternative way to write this is to open it first and then close it manually. But this makes our code a little bit longer. So by default, VS Code generates a self-closing tag like this. That is better. So does it mean we should never use embedded styles? No. Sometimes we want to overwrite the styles that are defined in an external style sheet. For example, let's say on this web page only, we want to change the color of our paragraphs. So we add a style element and define a new rule for our paragraph elements. Here we can set the color to black. And now, look, our paragraphs are black. So the rules that we define here overwrite the rules defined in an external style sheet. Okay? So these are two different ways to provide styles. But there is a third way. We can use inline styles to apply styles to a particular HTML element. So let's say out of these two paragraphs, I want to make the first paragraph blue, but only the first paragraph. Every HTML element has a style attribute, and this is where we can write one or more styles. So we can set the color to blue, add a semicolon, so we can type a second CSS declaration. So we can set font weight to bold. Now don't worry about these styles, we'll talk about them later. Now, let's look at the result. So the first paragraph is blue and bold. What we have here is an example of an inline style. Now, inline styles are pretty ugly. You should avoid them as much as possible because they violate the separation of concern principle. We're defining some styles in the middle of our markup. But what if we really want to make the first paragraph bold and blue? Well, there are better ways. For example, we can give this paragraph a unique identifier. So we set the ID to first, and then over here, we define a rule for our first paragraph. So we start our rule with a pound sign, and then we type the ID of our element. Now, the styles that we define here will only be applied to an element with this identifier. So now, we can take these two styles and move them over here. Okay, and then we can get rid of the inline style. Now we have better separation of concerns. So as you probably know, we have quite a few different browsers out there, and unfortunately, different browsers render some HTML elements differently. Now, to address this issue, we use a very popular style sheet called normalize.css. What this style sheet does is that it provides basic default styles for some HTML elements so they look exactly the same way across different browsers. And with this, we don't have to waste a lot of time dealing with these rendering issues across different browsers, okay? So just go to google.com and search for normalize.css. Now look at the first link, nicholas.github.io. On this page, you can download the latest version. You can also install this using npm, but this is for advanced users, so I'm not going to cover it at this point. So right-click on this button and save the file somewhere on your disk. Now back to our project, we currently have a style sheet over here, and we're going to add another style sheet. So now it's time to organize these style sheets inside a new folder called CSS. So I'm going to add a new folder here, CSS, in the root of our website. Now I'm going to move styles.css over here. Let's go to index.html and update the URL as well. So it should be css/styles.css. Next, we're going to drag and drop normalize.css into the CSS folder. Good. Now let me give you an example of what is happening here so it's no longer magic to you. For example, normalize.css sets the line height property of the HTML element to 1.15 because different browsers have different values for this property. Here's another example. Normalize.css sets the margin of the body element to 0. And with this rule, we're no longer going to have some space around the content of our body element. So the moment we link to normalize.css, you will see that this space will be gone. But don't worry, we'll come back and fix it in a second. So back to index.html. Before linking to styles.css, first we should link to normalize.css. So link, here we type css/normalize.css. Now save the changes. Look, the space that I was talking to you about is gone. So to solve this problem, we have to go to styles.css, and on the top, we're going to define a rule for the body element. Here we're going to set the margin to 10 pixels, and this will bring back the space that we had earlier. Now don't worry about the margin property at this stage. We're going to talk about it in more detail later in the course. So normalizing our CSS styles is a very important step in front-end development, and going forward, we're going to use normalize.css in all the future lessons. In CSS, we have a few different ways to select elements for styling purposes. We can select them by their type, by their ID, by their class, and their attributes. We have seen a few examples earlier in the course, but let's go through it one more time with more detail. First, let's get the terminology right. What we have over here is called a selector, because this is how we can select an element. Now in this example, we're selecting an element by its type, which is the body element, but we can also select an element by its ID. So in index.html, let's create a section with the ID of products. So using Zen coding, we can type section pound products and then press tab. So this generates the section element and give it the ID of products. Now to style this element, we can go to our style sheet and type pound products. So whenever we start with a pound, that means we're selecting with an ID. Now we can also select elements by their class. For example, here we can add 3 articles with the class of product. So we can type article, period, product, times 3. This generates 3 article elements with the class of product. Okay? Now, to style each article element, we can go to our style sheet and type period, product. Now here's a question for you. What is the difference between the ID and class attributes? We talked about this earlier in the course, so you should know the answer. Pause the video and think about it for a second. Here's the answer. We cannot have multiple elements with the same ID, but we can have multiple elements with the same class. Here's a metaphor. In the real world, we cannot have 2 people with the same passport number, right? By the same token, we cannot have 2 elements with the same identifier. So IDs must be unique, but we can have multiple elements with the same class, okay? So these are the most common way to select elements, by their type, by their ID, and their class. But we can also select elements by their attribute, which is not really that common, but I want to cover it here because you might see it in other people's code. So over here, let's add an anchor and link to google.com. And here we can say Google. Now, let's give this anchor the target element and set it to blank. Do you remember what this does? When we apply this attribute and click on this link will open in a new tab, okay? Now, let's say we want to select all anchor elements that have a target attribute. To do that, we can type a square brackets target. So we're checking for the existence of the target attribute, but the value doesn't matter. Now, if you want to be more explicit about the value, we can use an equal sign and type the value here, underline blank. As another example, let's select by the href attribute. So we can select anchor elements that point to Google, https google.com. Now, there's a problem with this code. Code like this is often fragile. A simple change in this link will break our style. Let me show you what I mean. So here I'm going to set the color to orange. Now, let's verify that our rule is working. So we get an orange link. Now, if I go back to index.html and add a / here, our rule breaks. The reason this is happening is because we're checking for the exact match. So that's why I said code like this is often fragile. To make our code more flexible, we can check for the existence of the word Google. So here we type Google, and then we prefix the equal sign with an asterisk. Now our rule is working, beautiful. If we make any changes to this link, for example, if we type a few more characters, our rule is still working. Now we can also check to see if the attribute starts with a given value. So here we type a caret and then replace Google with HTTPS. This will select all anchor elements whose href attribute starts with HTTPS. We can also check to see if the attribute ends with a given value. To do that, use a $sign. But we can also combine multiple conditions. For example, here I can type another square bracket and say the href attribute should start with HTTPS and end with .com. That's another way. But again, selecting by attributes is not really that common. Most of the time, we select elements by their type, ID, and class. So this is all about the basic selectors. Next, we're going to talk about relational selectors. So you have learned how to select elements using the basic selectors. But we can also select elements based on their relationship with other elements. Let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to generate a section with the ID of products. And in this section, I'm going to add a paragraph with 5 words. The content doesn't matter. Now let's say we want to style this paragraph element. One way to do this is by giving this element an ID or a class. But there's another way. We can start from this section. Because this section already has an ID, we can start here and then select the paragraph element inside this section. With this approach, we don't have to define an ID or class on this attribute. So our markup will end up being cleaner. Let me show you how this works. So we go to our style sheet and start with the product section. Then we select the paragraph element. So we're combining 2 different selectors, right? So here I'm going to set the color to orange. Let's make sure it's working. Good. So this is an example of a relational selector. What we have here is called a descendant selector. But don't worry about the terminology too much. Just understand how this works. Now, this rule will apply to any paragraph elements inside the product section. For example, if you go over here and after this paragraph, we add an article with a paragraph and type something else here, this second paragraph will also be orange. Let me show you. So save the changes, take a look. Both paragraphs are orange. But what if you wanted to style only the first paragraph? That is this paragraph element that is a direct child of the product section. To do that, we have to type a greater than sign in between these 2 selectors. Now, only the first paragraph is orange. We have another relational selector for selecting siblings. So back to index.html, after this section, I'm going to add another paragraph. Now, let's say we want to style this paragraph element that is a direct sibling of the section element. So it comes right after the section. To do that, we type a plus in between these two selectors. Now, the third paragraph is orange. So this will select the paragraph element that comes immediately after the product section. So if you go to our markup and add another paragraph element, this second paragraph is not going to be orange. Take a look. See? Only the third paragraph is orange. But what if you want to style all paragraph elements that come after the product section? Well, we can replace the plus sign with a tilde. Now, this will select all paragraph elements that are general siblings of the product section. So, both these two paragraphs are orange. So, relational selectors help us write cleaner markup because we don't have to assign IDs and classes to various HTML elements. But there are two problems with relational selectors that you need to be aware of. The first problem is that they can be fragile because they're dependent on the location of these elements in the DOM. So if you move elements around, our styles will break. Let me show you what I mean. So here we have a rule for selecting all paragraph elements that come after the product section. Now let's say tomorrow we decide to move this paragraph and put it before the product section. So I'm going to cut this line and then paste it over here. Now, this line is not going to be orange. Here you go. So if we move elements around, our styles will break. The second problem with these selectors is that they are not as performant as basic selectors. Now, don't think too much about this because most of the time, the difference is negligible. You cannot even tell the difference. But let me explain why these selectors are not as fast as basic selectors. The reason goes back to how browsers read and execute these selectors. We humans start from the left side and go to the right side. So we go to the product section and then select all paragraphs that come after, right? This algorithm is not efficient for browsers. They start from the right side. So when a browser sees the selector, it selects all paragraph elements in the DOM, and then for each paragraph element, it checks to see if that element comes after the product section. Now, imagine on this page we have 100 paragraph elements. So the browser will select all these 100 paragraph elements just to find out that there is only one paragraph element that comes after the product section. So all that time to query those 99 paragraph elements will be wasted. Now, once again, most of the time the difference is negligible. So don't optimize ahead of time. Remember the old saying in computer science, premature optimization is the root of all evils. So to recap, relational selectors help us write cleaner markup, but sometimes they can be fragile. If you're very confident that the location of these elements you're targeting is not going to change in the future, it's perfectly fine to use them. Otherwise, prefer to select elements by their ID or class. In this lesson, we're going to talk about another group of selectors called pseudo-class selectors. The name might sound a little bit complicated, but the underlying concept is actually very simple and useful. So let's define an article with 2 paragraphs. Now let's generate some dummy text here. Good. Now let's say we want to style the first paragraph and make the font bigger and italic. Here's one way to do this. We can give this paragraph a class, like first. Then we go to our style sheet and define a style for paragraphs with the class of first. Here we can set font size to 140%, so it's larger. And we can set font style to italic. Take a look. That's what we get. Very nice. Now, as I told you before, when we use class selectors, it's often a good practice to drop the element type. So if tomorrow we change the type of this element to something else, our rules will not break. Now, in this particular case, it doesn't really matter as much because it's very unlikely that we're going to replace a paragraph with something else. But I'm going to drop it regardless. Now, this rule will apply to any element with the class of first. What if we want this rule to be applied only to our articles? Well, here we can type the article element to give this a context, okay? So here's a basic way of doing this. However, the first step here was unnecessary. We didn't have to assign this element a class because in CSS, we have a bunch of pseudo classes that are automatically applied by the browser. So pseudo classes are not real classes that we define. they're classes that browsers apply by default. Let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to remove the class attribute. Now back to our style sheet. Instead of using this real class, we're going to use a pseudo class. All pseudo classes start with a colon, and here we type first child. Now, look, we get the same result as before, and we didn't have to assign a class to the first paragraph. What we have over here is called a pseudo class selector. So just like we have class selectors, we also have pseudo class selectors. Now, this first child selector is very useful, but it's a little bit fragile. Let me show you what I mean. So back to our markup, let's add a heading here and see what happens. See what happened? The first paragraph is no longer styled. The style that we defined is now applied to the heading because the heading is the first child of this article. Let's verify this. So right-click on the heading, go to Inspect. Now, over here, look at the rule that we just defined. This rule is applied to the heading because it's the first child of the article element. So this is the problem with the first child selector. If we move elements around, our CSS rules may break. So here we can use another pseudo class selector called first of type. Let's see how this works. So back to the browser. Look, both the heading and the first paragraph got the style that we just defined. What is going on here? Well, let's inspect this element one more time. So in this article, we have one heading element and two paragraphs. This pseudo class selector, first of type, is applied to the first occurrence of elements of different types. So here's the first H2 that we have. That is why this rule is applied to this element. Now below the heading, we have two paragraphs, and the first paragraph received the style that we just defined. So this pseudo class, first of type, is applied to the first occurrence of elements of different type in a container. Back to our style sheet, we want this rule to be applied only to the first paragraph in our article. So here we have to specify the element type, which is P. Now, back to the browser. Look, the first paragraph is italic, but the heading is not. So this is how first of type selector works. Now similarly, we have two other selectors called last child and last of type. Let's look at an example. So if you want to style the last paragraph in this article, we can say article P colon last of type, and here we can set font weight to bold. Now look, the last paragraph is bold. Now in this particular case, because this paragraph is the last child of the article, here we can also use last child. We get the same result. However, as I told you before, first child and last child are a little bit fragile, so if you add or remove elements, our rules may break. For example, if you add an anchor here, see, the last paragraph is no longer bold. But what about the link? How come the link is not bold? Because here we're targeting a paragraph that is the last child of the article. Currently, the last child of our article is not a paragraph element. It's a hyperlink. If we want this rule to be effective, we can remove the element type, and now this rule is applied to the last child of the article irrespective of its type. So, save the changes. Look, the link is bold. Now, sometimes we want to style elements based on their position in a container. For example, let's say we have a table or a list, and we want to highlight all the odd items. So here I'm going to define an unordered list. Inside this list, we're going to have 5 list items. So li times 5. Now, in each list item, we want to have some text like item 1, item 2, and so on. So here in braces, we can type item followed by a $sign. The $sign will be replaced by the numbers 1 to 5. So press tab. Here's what we get. Beautiful. Now we want to style all the odd items in this list. So back to our style sheet. We grab an unordered list and then select list items that are odd. So here we're going to use another pseudo class selector called nth child. Now this selector is like a function in programming languages. So in between parentheses, we can pass a value or an argument. So if you specify odd, this rule will target all the odd items in our list. So here we can set the color to deep pink. Take a look. Note that all the odd items are pink, and also the entire list is in bold, because now the list is the last child of the article element, okay? Now, similar to odd, we have even. Now all the even items are styled. We can also use a formula here, like 3n. This will select every third item in our list. It's not something that used that often, but just be aware of it. We also have a few pseudo-class selectors for working with hyperlinks. For example, look at this link. This link is currently displayed in purple because it's visited. This is the default color that browsers apply to visited links. But I don't like this color. I think it's ugly. So to select visited hyperlinks, we can type a:visited, and then apply a style here. We can set the color to something more interesting like Dodger blue. Okay, now look, this is much better. But what about a link that we haven't visited? So let's change the href here to https some weird website we haven't visited.com. Okay, look, this is the default blue assigned to hyperlinks. Once again, I don't like this color. So here we can add a comma and select all anchors that are links. This link pseudo class is automatically applied to all hyperlinks. Now, take a look. That's much better. But what about the hover effect? Let's say when the user hovers their mouse over this link, the color should change to pink. So here we can say a:hover. This pseudo class is applied when the user hovers over an element. It doesn't have to be a link. It can be anything. A div, a section, an image, pretty much anything. Now here we can set the color to deep pink. Now, look, that is much nicer. But let me show you something. We can use the tab key to go over some of the elements on this page. As you probably know, some users prefer to use keyboards. So if we press the tab key, our hyperlink is in focus, but the color hasn't changed. So as a best practice, whenever we use the hover pseudo selector, we should also use the focus pseudo selector. This pseudo class is applied when the user goes over the elements on the page using the tab key. Now, save the changes, take a look. We can use the tab key to select this link, and now our link has the right color. So this is all about pseudo classes. Next, we're going to talk about pseudo elements. Sometimes we want to style a part of an element, like the first letter or the first line of a paragraph. This is where we use pseudo element selectors. Let me show you how they work. So let's define a paragraph with some dummy text. Now we want to style the first letter of this paragraph. So I've selected the letter L. Now let's bring up the command palette and wrap the selection with a span element. So we have a span. Next, we can give this span a class like first letter. And then we can go to our style sheet and define a rule for elements with this class. Here we can set the font size to 140%, and we can also make the font bold. Okay, so here's what we get. That's pretty nice. You have seen this style in a lot of books, right? Now, this first step here was completely unnecessary because in CSS we have a bunch of pseudo elements for this very reason. So I'm going to delete this span. Now, back to the style sheet. Instead of this class, we're going to use a pseudo element selector. So we type P to target paragraphs. Then we type double colons followed by first letter. So we use double colons for pseudo elements, but a single colon for pseudo classes. What is the difference? Well, we use pseudo elements to style a part of an element. In contrast, we use pseudo classes to style an element in a particular state, like an anchor that is hovered. So let's save the changes. Look, we get the same result as before, and we didn't have to add a span to our markup. We have another pseudo element for selecting the first line of a paragraph. So we type P, double colons, first line. Here we can set font weight to bold. Now look, the entire first line is bold. Now if we select some text, by default, the background of the selection becomes blue. We can change that using a pseudo element. So we type P, double colon, selection. Here we can set the background color to pink. Now, the background is pink. However, this style is only applied to selections in paragraphs. So if we go to our markup and add a heading, and then select this heading, the background is still blue. So to make this rule more flexible, we can remove the element type And now any element that is selected will have a pink background. So let's save the changes. There you go. We have another useful pseudo element for inserting content before the content of an element. Let me show you what I mean. So back to our markup. Here we have a paragraph, and here's the content of the paragraph. What if we want to insert something before the content of every paragraph on our page? We go to our style sheet and type P before. Here we set the content property to, let's say, ... Let's see what we get. So now we have ... before the content of our paragraph. Let's right-click on ... inspect it. So here's our paragraph. Let's expand it. Do you see the pseudo element? ... before. So this pseudo element is like an element that is inserted into the DOM. But it's not a real concrete HTML element like a paragraph or a span. It's a pseudo element. Now, the content of this element is just ... But we can apply any other styles here. For example, we can set the display property to block, and this will convert this element from an inline element to a block level element. Remember the differences? A block level element starts on a new line and takes up the entire available space. So now, back to the browser. This pseudo element that we inserted is a block level element. It has taken the entire available space, and as a result of that, our paragraph starts on a new line. So with this pseudo element, we can insert some content before the content of an element. Similarly, we have another pseudo element called after for inserting content after the content of an element. So if we save the changes, now ... appears at the end of our paragraph. So if you have multiple paragraphs, every paragraph will have this new content at the end. So this is all about pseudo elements in CSS. Quite often, we end up in a situation where more than one rule can target a given element, and these rules can have conflicting styles. So let me show you how the browser figures out what rules should be applied. So let's define an article, and inside this article, let's define an h1 with the class of highlight. Okay, so here we say heading. Now, back to our style sheet, let's write a couple of different rules. We can write a rule for h1 elements and set their color to Dodger blue. Also, we can write a rule for elements with the class of highlight and set their color to deep pink. So now, both these rules target this h1 element. But which rule do you think is going to be applied? This is where selector specificity comes to play. Each selector has what we call a specificity or a weight. If multiple rules target the same element, the browser will apply the rule that is more specific. Now look at this triangle. This is what I call the specificity triangle. At the top of this triangle, we have the ID selector, because as you know, we cannot have two elements with the same ID. So the ID selector is very specific. It can only target a single element. Below the ID selector, we have class and attribute selectors. These selectors are less specific because we can have multiple elements with the same class or attributes. At the next level, we have the element selector because we can have many elements of a given type. So back to our style sheet, which selector do you think is more specific? The second selector, because we can have many h1 elements, but not all these h1 elements may have the class of highlight. So a class selector is more specific. And here in the browser, you can see our heading is pink. Now let me show you something. Let's right-click on the heading and go to Inspect. Here on the right side, you can see the class selector applied to this element that sets the color to pink. Below this selector, we have the element selector that sets the color to blue. But this property declaration is crossed out because it's been overwritten with the other property declaration over here. Now further down, we have another element selector that comes from normalize.css. So this style sheet applies a couple of styles to h1 elements. Further down, we have another element selector that comes from user agent style sheet. These are the default styles that Chrome applies to various elements. So every browser defines a set of styles for various HTML elements. That is why sometimes these styles are different, and we use normalize.css to normalize these styles. So we start from a common ground. Now back to our style sheet. Let's look at a few more examples. Another way to target this element is using an ID selector. So here in our markup, let's give this element an ID of products. Now back to our style sheet. Here we can define a rule for an element with the ID of products. And then we can set the color to green. This selector is the most specific selector, so now our heading is green. Now, what if you have two selectors with equal specificity or equal weight? So let's duplicate this rule and change the color to, let's say, brown. Which rule do you think will be applied? The rule that comes last. So if I save the changes here and go back to browser, look, our heading is brown. All right, now let's get rid of this rule. We don't need it anymore. Let me show you something really cool in VS Code. If we hover our mouse over a selector, we can see its weight or specificity. So here in parentheses, we have three numbers. The first number on the left represents the number of ID selectors. In this case, we have 0 because we don't have an ID selector. The number in the middle represents the number of class or attribute selectors. Again, we have 0 because we don't have a class or attribute selector. And finally, the number on the right represents the number of element selectors. Here we have one element selector. That is why we have 1 here. So overall, the specificity of this element is 1. Now compare this with the specificity of this other selector. Here we have 0, 1, 0 because we have one class selector and the total specificity is 10. So 10 is greater than 1, and that is why this selector, or this rule more accurately, takes precedence. So our heading is currently green, but what if we want it to be blue? How can we prevent this rule from overwriting this style? Well, we have two solutions here. One solution is to use the important keyword. So as part of this declaration, we type an exclamation mark followed by the important keyword. When we apply this keyword, other rules will be discarded. Let me show you. So save the changes and back in the browser. Our heading is blue. Now let's inspect it. So even though we have more specific rules, these rules are ignored because we have used the important keyword. Now, while this looks like an easy solution, you should avoid it as much as possible. Using the important keyword is considered a bad practice because it can make your CSS messy and hard to maintain. You will end up wasting a lot of time troubleshooting and fixing styling issues. So let's get rid of this and talk about a better solution. The reason our heading is green is because of the third rule we have applied here. Now, what is the specificity of this rule? It is 100. So to make the heading blue, we have to write a rule that is more specific. So look at these three numbers here. The left number represents the number of ID selectors, the middle number represents the class or attribute selectors, and the right number represents the element selectors. So the rule that we want to write should have at least one ID selector and additionally a class or an element selector. So here we can select an element with the class of highlight and the ID of products. So here we have one class selector and one ID selector. Let's look at the specificity. That is 110. So now, if we set the color to Dodger blue, our heading turns blue. Beautiful. Now, instead of a class selector, we can use an element selector. So we can target an H1 with the ID of products. This selector is more specific than the previous one. Let's look at the specificity. That is 101 compared to 100. So once again, we get a blue heading. Let me show you another way. Let's give this article element an ID or a class of featured. Now, back to our style sheet. We can select an element with the class of featured, and in this element, we can target an element with the ID of products. What do you think is the specificity of this rule? It should be 110, because we have one class selector and one ID selector. Take a look. 110. So we can get rid of the important keyword by writing a more specific selector. But don't go overboard with this approach. For example, I don't want you to write a selector like HTML, body, featured, H2, products, highlight. This selector is way too specific. It's really hard to read and understand this. And if in the future we run into styling issues, we'll have to write even a more specific selector. So our CSS will become really messy and hard to maintain. One of the important concepts in CSS you need to understand is the concept of inheritance, which means some CSS properties by default inherit values from their parent. Let's go through a few examples. So I'm going to define a paragraph with some dummy text. Now let's wrap this word inside a strong element. So we bring up the command palette, search for wrap, and then type strong. So here's what we get. Now, here in our style sheet, let's define a rule for paragraph elements and set their color to Dodger blue. Take a look. So our strong element is blue, even though we didn't explicitly set its color. This is inheritance in action. So the strong element is currently a child of the paragraph element, and it has inherited the color property. Let's verify it. So we right-click on this element and go to Inspect. Now look over here. These are the properties inherited from the paragraph element, in this case, color. So with inheritance, we didn't have to come here and set the color property on the strong element. So inheritance helps us write less code. But what if in this particular case, we want to stop the inheritance? What if we don't want to inherit this value? Well, we set the value to initial. This sets the color property to its default value, which is black. So here's what we get. Now let's look at a property that does not get inherited. So here in the paragraph, let's set the border to 1 pixel, solid, black. Take a look. So we have a border around our paragraph, but there is no border around the strong element because it doesn't make sense to define a border on a parent element and then every child inherits that border. It doesn't make sense. But what if we want to force the inheritance here? Well, here in the rule for the strong element, we set border to inherit. Now we are explicitly saying that we want to inherit the border property. So here's the result. We have an extra border around the strong element. So this is inheritance in action. But what properties are inherited? Well, there's a long list, and quite frankly, you don't have to memorize it. Most people don't know it. Most of the time, as you build more web pages or as you go through the course, you will get familiar with these properties. But generally speaking, the properties that are about typography are the ones that are inherited. So properties that change the font size, the vertical space between lines, the alignment of text, the color of the text, these are the properties that get inherited. All right, now let's talk about colors. In CSS, we have a few different ways to represent colors. We can use named colors, RGB values, HSL values, and hexadecimal values. Let's see this in action. So I'm going to define a div with the class of box. Now, let's define a role and give our box a width of 200 pixels, a height of 200 pixels, and a background color. Now, open up Google and search for color picker. So here in Google, we have a built-in color picker, but pretty much every design tool also has a color picker. So over here, we can move this pointer around to select a different color. Now, over here, look, as we move the pointer around, these values get updated, right? So what are these values? Well, let's look at RGB first. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit. So RGB is short for red, green, blue, and these three values represent the degree of red, green, and blue. So each value can be a number between 0 to 255. Now, you don't have to memorize any of this stuff. All I want you to understand is that this color that you can see over here can be represented by a combination of red, green, and blue according to these values. So if we copy these values, and then over here, we can use the RGB function to set the background color. So we paste the values, save the changes, and here's what we get. Now we have another function called RGBA, which is short for alpha. So with this function, we can supply an extra value, and this value can be a decimal number between 0 and 1. 0 means completely transparent, and 1 means completely opaque. So if we use a value like 0.5 here, our box is semi-transparent. So if you have something underneath, like an image, that image will be visible. This is a very popular technique we use in CSS. So RGB is one way to represent this number, but we can also represent it using the hexadecimal system. Hexadecimal is one of the many numerical systems. We have the binary system that contains the digits 0 and 1. We have the decimal system that contains the digits 0 to 9, and this is the system that we use to represent numbers. Hexadecimal is another system that contains the digits 0 to 9, as well as the letters A to F. We can represent any number in the world using any of these systems. Now, the actual mathematical concepts behind this is irrelevant here. You don't need to learn them. But let's look at a practical example. Look at this hexadecimal value. Here we have 6 characters, and every 2 characters represent one of the numbers in the RGB system. So E6 is the hexadecimal representation of 230 in the decimal system. As another example, CD is the hexadecimal representation of 205 in the decimal system. That is the concept behind this. So instead of using an RGB value, we can use a hexadecimal value. So we copy this and paste it over here. Here's what we get. Now, the limitation of hexadecimal system is that here we don't have the transparency channel. So if you want to make this box semi-transparent, we have to use the RGBA system. Another system for representing colors on the web is the HSL system, which is short for hue, saturation, lightness. Once again, we have 3 values here. The first value is the degree of the color on a standard color wheel. So look over here. Here we have a standard color wheel. That degree determines the tone of the color. Is it blue, red, green, or what? The second value is the percentage of the saturation, which can be a number between 0 to 100. So as we increase this value, our color becomes more saturated. Let me show you what I mean. So over here, if I move this pointer to the left, our color is less saturated, right? And now look, the saturation is reduced to 65%. The third value is the lightness. So as we increase this value, the color becomes brighter. And as we decrease it, it becomes darker and gets closer to black. Some people prefer the HSL system because they can pick the color shade and then play with these 2 numbers to create different shades of that color. So as an example, let's copy these values. And then over here, we're going to use the HSL function and paste these values. Just remember to remove the degree character because this is not a valid character in CSS. So save the changes. Here's what we get. Now, if we increase the saturation and let's say make it 100, our color is more saturated. We can also reduce the brightness and make it, let's say, 40%. And here's what we get. So this is the HSL system. Now, similar to RGB, we have a variation of this system that is HSL-A, which is short for alpha channel. So we can supply a force value here, which can be a decimal value between 0 to 1. If you want a semi-transparent box, we can use a value like 0.5. Now here in Chrome, we also have a color picker. Let me show you. So let's inspect this element. Here's the background color. Currently, we're using the HSL system. We can click on this box and see this color picker here. So I prefer this shade. That's better. Now over here, we can see the individual values, 53 for hue, 93% for saturation, 51% for lightness, and 1 for alpha, which means completely opaque. Now if we change these values here, our CSS is not updated. So here we have to press Enter to accept the values. Now we can copy this and paste it in our CSS. Now look, here's another way to represent HSL values. So instead of separating these values using commas, we have 53 degrees, 93%, and 51%. So this is all about color systems. Now, which system is the best? There is no such a thing. Depending on who you ask, you're going to get a different answer. But in my experience, most people prefer the hexadecimal system because it's shorter and more compact. But of course, RGB and HSL have their own uses. Now that you have learned about colors, let's talk about gradients. With gradients, we can create beautiful transitions between 2 or more colors. So continuing with the example from the last lesson, here we have set the background color property. Now we want to use a gradient. Now, gradients are technically images. So to set a gradient here, we cannot use the background color property. We should either use the background image property or the shorthand background property. We can set the background property to either a color or an image. So I'm going to replace this color with a gradient. To create a gradient, we call the linear gradient function and pass two colors. We can say Dodger blue and yellow. Now here I'm using named colors, but we can also use hexadecimal colors, RGB colors, RGBA colors, and so on. So let's save the changes and see what we get. Look, we get this beautiful transition from blue to yellow. Now by default, the direction of this transition is from top to bottom, but we can easily change it. So back to our function, as the first value or the first argument, we supply the direction. We can say to right. Now our gradient starts from the left and goes to the right. We can also target corners, like bottom right. So we can say to bottom right. Now the transition starts from the top left and goes to the bottom right. We can also specify a degree for more control over the transition. So look at these numbers: 0 degrees, 90 degrees, 180 degrees, and so on. So if we say 45 degrees, our transition will start from bottom left and goes to top right. Take a look. So we can say 45 degrees, and here's what we get. Now we can also specify the position of these colors. For example, we can say the yellow should start at about 30% of the available space. So take a look. Now most of the box is filled with yellow. If we change it to, let's say, 90%, the yellow is pushed over here. Now we can also supply more than two colors. For example, over here, let's get rid of this position and supply a third color like tomato. Here's what we get. So we can get pretty creative with these colors. So this is all about linear gradients. But in CSS, we have another type of gradient called radial gradient. So let's remove this value, and here we're going to call the radial gradient function. Just like before, we give it two colors. We can say white and yellow. So in the middle, we have a white circle that gradually transitions to yellow on the corners. Now here we have a circle shape because our div, our container, is a square. But if we change the width of this box and set it to 600, look, now instead of a circle, we have an ellipse. But we can easily create a circle. So as the first argument of this function, we pass circle. Now we get a circle in the middle. But we can also change the position of the circle. So we can say circle at top left. Take a look. Our circle starts here and gradually transitions to yellow. So this is how we can create gradients. But we also have online tools that help us easily create gradients, and they generate the CSS code for us. Let me show you. So here in Google, search for gradient generator. There are many tools out there. The one that I personally like is cssgradient.io. Look, here we have a gradient with three colors. All these colors are listed over here. We can see their hexadecimal value and their position. So the first color starts at 0%, the second color starts at 33%, and so on. Now in this demo, I just want to have two colors. So let's get rid of the second color. We have a purple and a yellow. Now we can easily change these colors. So here's the yellow we selected, and then over here, we can change it to a different color like orange. Similarly, we can select this purple and move this slider around to get a different color. Now by dragging these sliders, we can change the position of these colors. So now look, the orange starts at 8%, and that's why most of the box is filled with orange. I'm going to move it to, let's say, 90%. That looks good to me. Now down below, we can change the angle of this gradient. So by default, it's set to 90%, but we can change it to, let's say, 32%. And here's what we get. Now, over here, we can find the CSS code for this gradient. So look, we have two properties. background, which is set to just a plain color, that's an RGB color. And after that, we have a second background property that is set to linear gradient. Why do we have two properties? Because even though most browsers these days support gradients, there are still some old browsers that don't support gradients. So we use a plain color as a fallback for those browsers. If those browsers don't understand this linear gradient, they're going to ignore the second background property. So they will only see a plain color, which is this RGB color. Now we can copy this to clipboard and paste it over here. Now take a look. So here's the end result. Much easier than creating a gradient by hand. Alright, now let's talk about borders. We briefly talked about the border property before, but let's revisit it one more time with more detail. So this property takes three values. The first value is the thickness of the border. We can use 1 pixel for a really thin border, or 10 pixels for a thicker border. The second value is the style of the border. We can use solid, but we have other styles that we're going to look at in this lesson. The third value is the color. I'm going to go with royal blue. Once again, we can use a hexadecimal color or an RGB color and so on. So let's see what we get. Now, let's change solid to dotted. So instead of a solid line, we get a bunch of dots. Another popular style is dashed. Here's what we get. We have a bunch of other styles, but quite frankly, nobody uses them anymore. We used those styles 20 years ago, so I'm not going to go over them. Now, one thing you need to understand here is that this border property is what we call a shorthand property. It takes these values and applies them to borders on each side. But in CSS, we have a few other properties for defining the border on each side. For example, we can say border top should be 20 pixels, solid, royal blue. Let's see what we get. So the top border is thicker. Similarly, we have border right, border bottom, and border left. Now, one thing you need to pay attention to here is that the order of these lines matters. So here we have defined the general border on each side, that is 10 pixels thick, but then we are saying the top border should be 20 pixels thick. If I move this line up, see what we get? All borders are the same. So the order of these lines matters. In addition to border top, border right, border bottom, and border left, we also have border width. With this, we can specify the width of all borders. So remember this shape: top, right, bottom, left. This is how I memorize this syntax. So the first value represents the width of the top border. Let's say 10 pixels. The second value represents the width of the right border, 20 pixels. Then we have bottom, and then left. Let's see what we get. So top, right, bottom, and left. Now, another way to memorize this is TRBL. Top, right, bottom, left. You can say turbo. Now what we have on the right side is called a comment. We use comments to explain why we have done something in our code. They're completely ignored by browsers, okay? So this is how we can remember this syntax. Now, what if we remove one of these values? That was the width of the left border. In this case, the browser uses the same value as the right border. So take a look. We get the same result as before. Now, what if we remove this other value? That was the width of the bottom border. In this case, the browser takes the width of the top border. So once again, we get the same result as before. So in summary, 1020 is the same as 1020, 1020. This is the short way of writing this code. Now, what if we remove this value? We only have 10 pixels. The browser will apply this width to all borders. Okay. Now, similarly, we have border style. Once again, we can supply different styles for top, right, bottom, and left borders. And we also have border color. Now, we have other longhand properties like border top color, border left color, and so on. But quite frankly, they're hardly used. 99% of the time, we use the shorthand form. So you don't need to memorize any of these properties. Just be aware that you have full control over the width, style, and color of each of the borders. Okay? Now, one other property we're going to talk about in this lesson is border radius. We briefly talked about this before. With border radius, we can make the corners round. So if we supply a value like 10 pixels, we get a little bit of round corners. If we increase this value and say 50 pixels, we get even more rounded corners. Now, earlier I showed you a trick. If you have a square, so let's change the width to 200 pixels. If you have a square and set the border radius to 100%, we get a full circle. Now, using CSS, we can also create other shapes like triangles, stars, and so on. I'm not going to go over them in this course because they become repetitive. You can learn them on your own. Let me just show you what to look for. So, in Google, search for CSS shapes, and look at this article on CSS3.com, the shapes of CSS. This is a great website for learning CSS. So this is how we can create a square. We can also create a rectangle, circle, which you have seen. Now, in this example, we have border radius set to 50%. That should work most of the time, but in my experience, sometimes we don't get a perfect circle, so I personally prefer to use 100% for the border radius. Then we have oval, triangle up, triangle down, and so on. So in case you're curious, look at this page to see what other shapes you can create with CSS. Alright, now let's talk about shadows. In CSS, we can easily add shadows around elements using the box shadow property. Here we have to supply a few values. The first value is the horizontal distance of the shadow to the element. If you use a positive value here, this will move the shadow to right, and if you use a negative value, this will move the shadow to left. You will see that in a second. So let's go with 10 pixels. The second value is the vertical distance of the shadow to the element. Once again, if you use a positive value, this will move the shadow down, and if you use a negative value, this will move the shadow up. So, before going any further, let's save the changes and see what we get. So, here it is. Look, we have moved the shadow 10 pixels right and 10 pixels down. Now, if we supply a negative value here, this will move the shadow 10 pixels left. Take a look. So our shadow moved 10 pixels to the left of the box. So, let's go with 10 pixels and 10 pixels. Now, if you want to change the color, we can pass that here. We can say gray. And once again, we can use a hexadecimal color, an RGB color, and so on. So, now we get a gray shadow. Now, what if you want to make this shadow a little bit softer? Here we can supply a third value to determine how much we want to soften or blur the shadow. Let's go with 10 pixels. Look, our shadow is softer. Let's go with a higher value. Let's say 30 pixels. It's even softer. There's just one tiny problem. Because we moved the shadow 10 pixels right and 10 pixels down, it's not covering the top and left side of the box. So let me show you a cool trick here. If you want to have a very soft shadow, it is best to put the shadow right below the element. So we're not going to supply a horizontal and a vertical distance. We're going to pass 0 and 0. This will place the shadow right under the box, and with this blur, we'll see a very nice effect around the box. Take a look. Here it is. So this is how we can add shadows to elements. But we can also add shadows to our text. So here in index.html, let's add a heading inside this box. Heading. We get a black heading. First, I want to change the color of the heading to white because typically white text looks better on blue background. So let's go to our style sheet and define a rule for h1 elements. Here we're going to set the color to white. Now, using the text shadow property, we can add a shadow to this heading. The values that we should pass here are exactly the same values that we have for the box shadow property. So we can move the shadow 3 pixels right, 3 pixels down, and make it 5 pixels soft, and set the color to, let's say, gray. Now take a look. Here's what we get. Let me zoom in. I want to show you a problem with the shadow. This gray shadow is not mixing properly with the blue background. It's kind of off. Do you see that? Let me show you a cool trick. So instead of passing an explicit color like gray, we're going to use a semi-transparent black. So we use the RGBA function Now we pass 0, 0, and 0 to represent the pure black. Now using the fourth value, we can specify the transparency. 0 means completely transparent, and 1 means completely opaque. For this demo, I'm going to go with, let's say 0.2. So this is a semi-transparent black. Now take a look. See, the shadow is beautifully blending with the blue background. And that means if we change the color of the background, the shadow will continue to blend properly. So let's set the background to gold. Take a look. Our shadow is still blending with the background. We can go with a different color like coral. Look, it's always working. So this is one of those cases where you may want to use an RGBA color. That's why earlier I told you that there is no right or wrong when it comes to representing colors. Sometimes a hexadecimal value makes sense, other times an RGBA color. Alright, we have reached the end of the first part of the series. Thank you so much for allowing me to be your instructor, and I hope you have learned a lot. In the next part, we're going to talk about the advanced concepts in HTML and CSS. We'll talk about layouts, topography, images, forms, transformations, transitions, animations, and writing clean and maintainable CSS code. If you want to build real websites, you have to master this concept, and that's what the second part is all about. So, I will see you in the next part.